Okay, and good afternoon. Welcome and thank you for attending the Jobs Australia National Youth Forum. Today's youth, tomorrow's future. A three-part series with today's theme being Youth Matters. My name is Ben Vassilo and I'm the proud CEO of Youth Projects. But for the next 3 Tuesdays, I'll be moonlighting as the MC of this virtual event in hope to facilitate some robust and important conversation about the future of work for our young people. Before I kick off, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I stand today, the Boon Wurrung people. I would also like to pay respect to our elders past, present and emerging of the Kulin Nation and extend that respect to other Indigenous Australians present. In COVID times and any international crisis, what we see is young people are often first out of work and often last back into work. Over the next 3 Tuesdays, we'll explore a range of topics from a diverse set of speakers, including all of you. Day 2 and day 3 are full of workshops designed to capture feedback and experiences from the sector, as well as young people and employers. The concept for the forum has its nexus in many discussions Jobs Australia completed with members on how COVID-19 and the pandemic would impact the employment futures of young people in employment services programs. Australia is just a few months into the return of mutual obligations. With the ending of JobSeeker and JobKeeper, the delayed and full impact of the pandemic is now becoming evident. The predictions discussed in 2020 are sadly becoming a reality. Never has it been so difficult for young Australians to find employment. With the various federal government special supports at their end, now is the earliest time possible for members to collaborate and review how collectively we approach the challenges for young people today. We'll take a look at our reality, both socially and economically, but with hope and with aspiration. In the early stages of the pandemic, government elected officials frequently referred to snap back and return to normal pre-pandemic employment conditions. As the impacts of the pandemic extended, Jobs Australia members expressed concern in response to those terms. Members felt there would not be a return to the pre-COVID-19 employment market conditions. The question as to the suitability and relevance of the current support programs for young job seekers was frequently raised. Members felt there were opportunities to examine and review and then recommend opportunities to further assist young people to achieve employment readiness and then ultimately employment outcomes. So here we are. The 3 key objectives of this forum, as requested by members, are to understand the current economic and social impacts affecting employment of young people, to understand the current situation for young people and the employer views on employment, and finally, to identify areas for improvement and make recommendations to government. Day 1 is pretty exciting, and what a way to start. We'll hear from Saul Esleg, Emma Dawson and Keith Waters. Then towards the end of the session, we'll hold a panel discussion in which you'll all get to ask questions of the 3 speakers. But before we kick off, a quick word from our partner. Social Ventures Australia is a not-for-profit organisation that works with partners to alleviate disadvantage towards an Australia where all people and communities thrive. One example of their work is the Review Platform, a fantastic initiative that is empowering organisations to deliver effective youth employment programs by providing free access to tools and resources that enable good practice. Those around me will know that I'm a big supporter of the Review Platform, and we've been using it at Youth Projects for some time. We have here today Lisa Folkes, Director of Ventures. Lisa has spent over a decade working in employment services, including as CEO of a large non-profit employment services provider across urban, regional and remote Australia. Over to you, Lisa.
Thanks, Ben. Look, thank you for just giving me 5 minutes and I'll let you get on with the action. I just wanted to, really thank Jobs Australia for convening this forum and for our opportunity to be part of it. Social Ventures Australia is a not-for-profit organisation, as Ben said. We are not an employment service provider. What we're really interested in doing is trying to bring a range of different strategies or tools. They range from consulting to impact investing to, in my area, philanthropically funded sort of innovation initiatives to try to see how we can do better in all sorts of parts of society, all sorts of social problems. So Social Ventures Australia works in early childhood, it works in housing, it works in a range of areas, but in my area and some of my colleagues are with me on the line, is in employment. So what we're interested in trying to understand is what needs to change in terms of business as usual, what needs to change in order to improve employment outcomes, not just the quantity but quality of jobs. And we're interested in both policy and practice. So what sorts of policies need to change, what sorts of practices need to change. The online review platform is a great example of an attempt to support practice change. So anyone here who would like to talk with us about what we can do to help your organisation bring the voices of young people into understanding your performance, please let us know. There'll be some contact details provided. But, we're really keen to try to support organisations to do the best they possibly can. And on policy as well, what's really clear, and why we're so excited to be supporting this event, is that business as usual won't deliver good outcomes. Even before the pandemic, young people were taking much longer to get into full-time work. Their incomes were on decline. And we need to do everything we can collectively to identify the sorts of enabling practices and policies that will give young people entering the labour market a better chance for not just for any old job, but for actual career path, income mobility, and the sort of future that we aspire to create. So thanks for my 5 minutes. I'm really looking forward to today and for the next couple of days. And thank you to Jobs Australia for partnering with us, or allowing us to partner with you to support this event.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Lisa, and great to have Social Ventures Australia on board as our partner. Just a quick note, we would typically have Deborah Cesara, the CEO of Jobs Australia, with us at this point in time, but unfortunately she's unable to make it today. Deb sent me a very brief note that I would like to read out on her behalf. So just bear with me as I read this out on behalf of Deb. I can't tell you how disappointed I am not to be in attendance today. But given that I mantra to staff regularly, health and family first, I must practice what I preach. Unfortunately, due to some reparative surgery, I'm incapacitated this week and will not be able to attend the Youth Forum session. Nevertheless, I wanted to say, have a wonderful event. This is very exciting for Jobs Australia to launch this youth-focused forum following the recent re-establishment of the Community of Interest for Youth Activities and TTW Providers Group. My vision and motivation are always to have as much integration across the broad spectrum of Jobs Australia's diverse membership as possible. It is always of greater benefit when the flow of conversation, networking, and sharing of experience can work to bring many moving parts to collaborate on the bigger picture. The richness of Jobs Australia is that our membership is diverse and with so many areas of expertise. I believe through shared knowledge and shared interest, we can do so much more to offer greater representation of the shared interest. I cannot sign off without a huge shout out to two groups of people. Firstly, the crew that have pulled this event together, the Jobs Australia staff, the Youth Project, Social Ventures, the community of interest participants, and the guests who have agreed to speak and participate. I thank you very much. And secondly, to you, the attendees. Our events are only as successful as supported by attendance. We appreciate the time you commit to join the dialogue. If we don't have attendees, we don't have an event. So thank you. I look forward to seeing you soon. And Deb, from all of us here, we're wishing you a very speedy recovery. Okay, it's time to get cracking. I can see the man to my right ready to go. This is going to be a very informative series of speakers and panel towards the end of the day. What I will ask is that we hold questions towards the end, but what you can do is use the chat box function. If we get time at the end of each speaker's presentation, we will take those questions. And if not, we will hold them over to the panel discussion at the end of the day. So please make sure you get those questions in through the chat box. So first up, we have Mr. Saul Eslake, who is looking forward towards the horizon, a forward view of the Australian economy post-COVID-19. So a little bit about Saul and his credentials. Saul Eslake worked as an economist in the Australian financial markets for more than 25 years, including positions with Macintosh Securities, National Mutual Funds Management, the ANZ Bank, the Bank of America Merrill Lynch. He's also been a director of the Productivity Growth Program at the then newly established Grattan Institute, a wonderful think tank. In 2015, Saul started up his own economics consultancy business, and in 2016 took up the role as Vice Chancellor's Fellow at the University of Tasmania. Saul is a member of the Australian Parliamentary Budget Officers Advisory Panel, the Australian Tax Office's Tax Gap Advisory Panel, and is on the advisory board of Jamieson Coote Bonds, a Melbourne-based specialist bond investment manager. He also chairs the CSIRO's Climate Forecasting Advisory Board. He is a non-executive director of the Macquarie Point Development Corporation and was previously on the board of Hydro Tasmania. Saul has first-class honours degrees in economics from the University of Tasmania and a graduate diploma in applied finance and investment from the Security Institute of Australia. And in December 2012, he was awarded an honorary degree from the University of Tasmania, as well as attending the Senior Executive Program at Columbia University's Graduate School of Business in New York. What an absolute fantastic resume and CV, Saul. Over to you and welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Ben, for that fulsome introduction and creating such expectations to which I have to live up. My thanks to Richard Butler and the team at Jobs Australia for inviting me to be part of this forum as well today. I'm speaking to you from my home just outside Hobart, which is on the traditional lands of the Muanina people. And I'd pay my respect in particular to the elders past, present and emerging of the Tasmanian Aboriginal people, or the Palawa people of Lutruwita, as they call themselves, but also more broadly to Aboriginal people who might be attending this conference or in other ways participating in it. So I'm going to share a screen, which I hope will allow everyone to see the slides that I want to use. And in doing that, let me begin, first of all, by calling those ones up and noting that Australia has, in the past 12 months, experienced our first recession by the most commonly used definition of that in almost 30 years. Now, in saying that, let me say I don't much care for the commonly used definition of recession, which holds that if you have 2 or more consecutive quarters of negative growth in real GDP, that constitutes a recession, and that if you don't have that, you haven't had a recession. In this particular instance, if it hadn't been for the bushfires in New South Wales, Victoria and South Australia in late December, early January 2020, we probably wouldn't have had that minus 0.3% in the March quarter of last year that we actually had, in which case, all else being equal, we would have had 1 quarter of negative growth in real GDP. And even though that would have been or was the biggest quarterly contraction in Australia's history, which goes back in this context to 1959, by that common definition, we wouldn't have had a recession, and we'd still have been talking about now approaching 31 years without having had a recession. And then I said there, if you can see it, yeah, right. It's a silly definition, and a much more sensible definition is one which says that a recession is when the unemployment rate rises by 1.5 percentage points or more in 12 months or less. And there's no argument that that's what we had last year. And we also had that experience during the financial crisis of 2008-9, and we also had it during the so-called tech wreck of 2000-2001. And the advantage of a definition like that is that while the 99.99% of people who aren't economists wouldn't know what a contraction in real GDP was if they fell over it, nearly all of us know what a significant increase in unemployment looks and feels like either because some of us are unfortunate enough to experience it ourselves, or more commonly, we know someone, we might be related to someone, or we know someone who's found themselves in that unfortunate position. And so by that definition, we've certainly had one of our most serious recessions in the last 50 years during the past 12 months. Although fortunately, even by that definition, it hasn't been nearly as long as the recessions that we experienced, for example, in the early 90s or the early 1980s. It's been a very different episode from the typical or garden variety recession, as you might call it. Our recession, however you measure it, hasn't been as severe as those experienced in the countries that we're used to comparing ourselves with. So, for example, just in terms of real GDP, ours fell by less than in New Zealand, Japan, the UK, or the United States. More importantly, in the context of today, we had a less significant fall in employment than the United States, though more significant than in the Euro area, New Zealand, or Japan. The thing that distinguished the United States from other countries is that almost uniquely among advanced economies, the US did not have any kind of furlough scheme like our JobKeeper or the equivalent in New South Wales. Our JobKeeper scheme, as you will all know, had some holes in it. In particular, it excluded the universities who did shed jobs and the big banks who didn't, but it also didn't do much for those who are casual employees and who hadn't worked sufficient hours with one employer in the period immediately before the onset of COVID to have been picked up by that. And there were some other cracks in Australia's safety net as well that weren't so obvious in the equivalent schemes in other countries. We therefore experienced a bigger rise in unemployment than in most other comparable countries, with the significant exception of the United States. But we've also since then seen quite a significant and much faster than expected decline in the unemployment rate and a rebound in the level of employment that actually puts us together with New Zealand, and although I haven't shown it on this chart, Taiwan, as the only so-called advanced or industrialized economies in the world where the level of employment is now actually above where it was at the onset of the pandemic. And broadly speaking, there are two reasons for that. One, of course, is that Australia's done a better job than almost any other advanced economy, with the exception of Taiwan and in most respects New Zealand, in keeping the pandemic at bay. And I've always thought, though many other economists took a different view early on, that there never was really any trade-off between, as some politicians put it at the time, lives and livelihood. There wasn't really a choice between shutting the economy down and saving lives. What experience has shown since then is that if you can't keep the virus under control, then you're going to experience protracted or recurring lockdowns. And if governments aren't prepared to do that, then as Sweden's experience demonstrates, people are still going to curb their activities in ways that will have significant economic consequences for fear of catching the virus, whether the government imposes restrictions on what they do or not. So our success at keeping the virus at bay, which is partly a reflection of the fact that we're an island and it's thus been much easier to keep it out than it is in countries, for example, in Europe, which share land borders with their neighbours. But it's also because our governments have, for the most part, been prepared to listen to and act upon scientific and professional advice, unlike the US administration under Trump or the Johnson administration, Johnson government in the UK, which tended to ignore professional advice. And our population has been reasonably willing to comply with government diktats as to what they can and can't do. So that's been one important factor. The other important factor has, of course, been that the Australian government has been pretty generous in the support it's provided to businesses and households in the face of the pandemic. I mentioned before that our JobKeeper scheme certainly had some cracks in it, that weren't apparent in the equivalents in a whole raft of other countries. But in other respects, the income support that's been provided to individuals and the subsidies and other assistance that has been provided to businesses has been larger as a proportion of our national income than in all but 3 other advanced economies, as the chart on the right hand shows. And what I'm focusing on in saying that is the solid bars in the right hand chart, which show dollars actually spent, or either in direct spending or tax measures. And I'm not really counting the shaded areas in that chart, which refer to contingent liabilities and loan guarantees that some countries, although Australia wasn't one of them, were also significant parts of their policy responses. So that combination of keeping the virus at bay and providing pretty comprehensive support to incomes and in other ways households and businesses who were affected either by the pandemic or the restrictions required to keep it at bay, I think explain why on the employment front, after some initial missteps, Australia has done pretty well in keeping people out of unemployment and getting them back to work. And of course, as we've seen in recent months, the growth in employment has been surprisingly strong. It's averaged more than 60,000 or half a percentage point a month, and that's been enough to reduce the unemployment rate to 5.6%. That is just under half a percentage point higher than it was prior to the onset of the pandemic by March. And it's worth remembering in that context that in last year's budget, that is, in October last year, the government had been expecting that the unemployment rate would still be above 6% by the beginning of 2024. So although the unemployment rate's still higher than we want it to be, and I'll come back to that in a moment, it certainly hasn't risen as much or stayed high for as long as we had feared as recently as 6 months ago. Obviously, employment is just simply whether you have a job or not. It doesn't say anything about whether that's full or part-time. So we can also take some comfort from the fact that a majority of the jobs that have been added since the end of October last year have been full-time ones. In fact, 3/4 of them have been. So that total hours worked is now, as of March, above its pre-pandemic level. Initially, a drop in the participation rate in April and May last year disguised the true extent of the rise in unemployment, because about 3.25 percentage points, 3.25% of the workforce simply stopped looking for work during those periods, either because they didn't expect they could find work or they weren't allowed out of their houses at all in order to look for it, although there are other ways of searching for jobs, of course. But now that the participation rate is back to, and indeed above, its pre-pandemic level, it's actually at a record high, there isn't any more hidden unemployment today than there was prior to the onset of the pandemic. As I say, if it hadn't been for that drop in the unemployment, in the participation rate, unemployment would have got, as measured by the Stats Bureau, up almost to 12%, and it's now down to 5.6%. Encouragingly, perhaps, the underemployment ratio, which measures the proportion of the workforce who have a job but are working fewer hours than they're willing and able to, is not only below where it was prior to the onset of the pandemic, but it's actually the lowest it's been in almost 7 years. And when you bring those two concepts together in the so-called underutilization rate, which measures those who are either unemployed but actively looking for work, or underemployed in the sense that they'd like to work more hours than they currently do. Well, after a 6 percentage point increase in the first couple of months of the pandemic, that's now down to, and admittedly still high, 13.5%, but it's below pre-pandemic levels, the lowest since December 2019. I don't want to suggest that, we've got to where we want to be in any sense of the word in saying what I've just said in the last couple of minutes, but this is a much better situation than we had feared it would be when the pandemic first broke, when the budget was brought down in October last year, or indeed even at the time of the mid-year review of the budget just before Christmas last year. As you all know, probably better than I do. The unemployment rate as published by the Stats Bureau doesn't capture every dimension of unemployment. So people have created their own concepts of the effective unemployment rate, which in my case sought to take account not only of those who dropped out of the workforce altogether and hence weren't counted as unemployed, but also those people who were counted by the Stats Bureau as having been employed, even though they actually weren't working any hours for economic reasons. Now, there aren't any people left who dropped out of the workforce during the early stages of the pandemic. They, or people replacing them, are all either back at work or actively looking for work. There are still a relatively small number of people who are counted as working, even though they're not actually doing any hours, but they have also declined quite significantly, so that the effective unemployment rate, as I've defined it, which got up to a peak of 15.3% in April, is now down as of March to 6%. It's been widely expected that with the end of JobKeeper at the end of March, there'd be some at least temporary increase in both measured and unmeasured unemployment. The Treasury, for example, forecasts that there'd be job losses of between 100 and 150,000 in the period after the end of JobKeeper. And if that turned out to be right, then all else being equal, if those folks weren't able to find alternative employment, the unemployment rate as measured would have risen by between 0.7 and 1 percentage point. In other words, it could have been back in excess of 6.5%. We obviously don't have employment or unemployment data for April or May yet, but weekly data that's published by the Department of Social Security. In fact, they get it every week, but unlike the United States, where they've been publishing that data every Thursday morning since 1968, in Australia, it's usually regarded as a state secret, but the Department of Social Security has been making it available to a Senate Select Committee reviewing the government's responses to COVID on a fortnightly basis. And based on that data, along with some estimates that the Treasurer dropped in a speech he gave just over a week ago, it would appear that the number of people on JobKeeper or Youth Allowance Other has declined by 40,000 in the 3 weeks after the end of JobKeeper. And in fact, the payroll employment data that was released just over an hour ago for the second 2 weeks in April also suggests that there hasn't been a significant decline in jobs, or at least in payroll jobs, in the 4 weeks since JobKeeper terminated at the end of March. If you look at this chart, you can see that there were falls in employment in the first 2 weeks after the end of JobKeeper, and another small fall in the third week, followed by an increase in the week ended just before Anzac Day. But I'd caution that this data is not seasonally adjusted. And of course, in the 2 weeks after JobKeeper, or the 3 weeks after the end of JobKeeper, we also had the Easter break and school holidays in most states, during which typically, as you can also see, occurred in December, January, and at around this time last year, if you look over to the left-hand side of the chart, probably that decline that you can see over the first 3 weeks of April is seasonal. And the fact that we've only seen a net drop of about 1.2% in the number of payroll jobs over the 4 weeks since the end of JobKeeper suggests, at least tentatively, that the number of job losses flowing from the end of the JobKeeper scheme will be less than the number that had been officially estimated by Treasury beforehand. If we look at the labour force data, which is only up until March, that tells us that Queensland and Western Australia have experienced the strongest recoveries in employment since the worst point of the pandemic around 11 months ago. And by contrast, the weakest recovery in employment has been in Tasmania. The figures for the Northern Territory are a bit hard to read because they're inherently more volatile, and because the Northern Territory had been in something that I would call a recession almost for 5 years since the end of the construction of the Ichthys LNG plant at Darwin. But it does seem from that and other data that the Northern Territory might actually be coming out of that period in amidst the aftermath of the pandemic. Let me make a couple of other observations, though, about what's happened to employment that dig a bit deeper than the figures that I've just been mentioning. As was widely recognised at the time, younger workers bore a disproportionate share of the job losses that occurred in the early phase of the pandemic, as did women, largely because young people and women tend to account for a larger share of employment in those sectors of the economy that were most impacted by the social distancing and other restrictions that governments imposed in order to prevent the spread of the virus. But while other groups have had more success in regaining jobs as the economy has reopened, as you can see from this chart, up till March, it's been people aged between 15 and 19, and people aged between, or 15 and 24, I should say, and people aged between 25 and 34 who have still yet to regain the level of employment that they had before the onset of the pandemic. In other words, it's been more difficult for younger people to get back into employment than it has been for people who are aged 35 or above. It's also the case, and there's obviously some overlap here, that workers in low pay industries experienced a greater proportion of the job losses and have since experienced greater difficulties in returning to employment than people who work in relatively highly paid industries. And again, of course, there's a significant overlap between low paid workers or people working in industries that typically pay below average weekly earnings, and on the other hand, young people and women. So it's not surprising that you see both of those observations. And the third one that I want to make is that people who are working in occupations such as community and personal service workers, sales workers, and labourers have borne the brunt of job losses since the onset of the pandemic. And as you can see, whereas by contrast, managers and professionals now have about 5% more jobs than they did in February last year, people in those other occupational categories I mentioned, especially labourers, but also community and personal services workers, clerical and administrative workers, and sales workers, have yet to regain the levels of employment that they had before the onset of the pandemic. Again, there's some overlap there, not so much in the case of labourers, who are predominantly adult men, but although there are some young men in that category too, but younger people and women tend to be concentrated in the occupations that have had the toughest time, both during the downside of the pandemic and subsequently during the recovery phase in getting back to work. So there are, when you dig below the headlines, there are still some longer term or lingering issues with employment for young people, for women, for people with lower levels of educational attainment or other forms of professional or trade qualifications in getting back to work. Just looking forward a little bit more, an important point, I think, is that the closure of Australia's borders has played an important role in explaining why the unemployment rate never rose as much as had been feared and has come down more quickly than had been forecast by the government, the Reserve Bank, and almost everybody else. And the reason here is that people who are looking for work aren't competing with migrants for the jobs which are available in the way that they've needed to for most of the last 30 years. In the 20 years, or here I've shown 10 years, leading up to the onset of the pandemic, the civilian working age population, that is people aged 15 and over who aren't in the defence forces, increased by an average of about 27,000 per month. And with an unchanged participation rate, that effectively meant that you needed to see employment growing by 16,000 a month in order to keep the unemployment rate constant. If you did better than that, the unemployment rate would fall. If you did worse than that, the unemployment rate would go up. As it happens, the monthly change in employment over the 10 years to March 2020 was about 16,000 a month, which is why the unemployment rate was on net almost unchanged between the final quarter of 2010 and the final quarter of 2019. It went from 5.1% to 5.2% over that period. Of course, in practice, it went up a bit more than that, but it never fell below 5% because 16,000 new jobs a month on average over that period wasn't enough to absorb both those entering the labour force from within and those arriving into Australia as migrants and looking for work. But since October last year, growth in the working age population has averaged just under 9,000 a month. And that means that with an unchanged participation rate, bearing in mind that it's now at a record high, employment only needs to grow at an average rate of 5,500 per month in order to prevent the unemployment rate from rising. In fact, as I mentioned before, since the end of October, employment's grown by an average of more than 60,000 a month, and that more than anything else explains why the unemployment rate has fallen so rapidly. So looking forward, anything that results in employment growth of more than 5,500 a month is, while our borders remain closed, which we're going to be told in tonight's budget is likely to be until the middle of 2022, is going to drive the unemployment rate down even further than we've currently seen it. And given that there do seem to be a lot of jobs around, according to any number of published measures of job vacancies, and that the ratio of the number of people looking for work to the number of vacancies there are is the lowest it's been since before the onset of the financial crisis, there ought to be, in principle, a reasonable prospect for those who are looking for work to find jobs. Although that, of course, does beg the important question that other people are going to talk about in more detail over the rest of this forum, about whether those who are looking for jobs have the skills that are being sought. And obviously, in a number of cases, the answer to that question is going to be no. Of course, migrants do bring with them spending and demand that helps to create jobs, and we're not getting that. So an important question is, in the absence of the economic activity that migrants generate, how can we be sure that there will still be sufficient demand in the economy to create even 5,500 new jobs a month? Part of the answer to that is that turning Australia into a prison from which we're not allowed to leave, as our governments have done, and I should say in passing, Australia is the only democratically governed country in the world which has sought to ban its citizens and residents from leaving as one of the ways of keeping the pandemic at bay. New Zealand hasn't done that. The only other country which has done it, and it represents interesting company for us in current political circumstances, is China, which is not a democratically governed country. But nonetheless, while there's been a lot of attention on the consequences for our universities and our tourist industry of the fact that tourists and students aren't allowed to come to Australia, far less attention has been given to the fact that Australians aren't allowed to go overseas unless they're cricketers or Olympic athletes or former prime ministers wanting to help their country of birth negotiate trade treaties, or former ministers trawling around for positions with international agencies. But excluding them, Australians aren't allowed to leave. That's actually perversely provided a significant form of stimulus to domestic spending, because the trade figures tell us that if they'd been allowed out, Australians would have spent some $55 billion overseas in the last 12 months. But because we haven't been allowed out, except for those exceptions I mentioned before, in fact, Australians have spent barely $1 billion overseas in the last 12 months. Now, that money's still been there. They've had it, but it would seem that a significant proportion of the money which Australians would have spent overseas if they'd been allowed to has instead been spent at home, on their homes, on the things in their homes so that they can work effectively from home or have more congenial surroundings when they're not working at home. It's been spent on cars, it's been spent on clothes, it's been spent on accessories and things like that. Probably not as much has been spent on domestic tourism as has been spent on overseas tourism, because people are still worried about being in some other part of the country and then finding themselves caught in an arbitrary lockdown, especially if they were thinking of going to Western Australia, for example. But the spending that Australians have done at home, which they'd have preferred to have done overseas, is actually greater than the spending we're not getting because we're not allowing foreign tourists and students into the country. So there is a form of stimulus to demand and to employment for as long as the borders remain closed that is in effect making up for the loss of spending we would otherwise have been getting from migrants and from foreign students and from foreign tourists coming to Australia. So I'm reasonably confident that the unemployment rate will continue to decline and that we will be pleasantly surprised, in a sense, as to how far we can get the unemployment rate to go down. And the interesting thing is now that we have both the Reserve Bank, which controls monetary policy, and the government, which controls fiscal policy, in agreement that that is what policy should be seeking to do. That is to get lower unemployment rates than have been deemed feasible without generating higher inflation by economic policy makers since the mid-1970s. And in saying that, they're obviously drawing on US experience, which tells us that the labour market needs to get a lot tighter than had previously been thought before there's any need to worry about wage or price inflation getting out of control. In the United States, for a long time, the Federal Reserve and other policymakers have worked on the assumption that an unemployment rate of around 5% is consistent with full employment. That is, it's what economists sometimes call the natural rate of unemployment or the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, the NAIRU, below which inflation starts to rise, and therefore the traditional conventional wisdom has been that you have to stop unemployment falling below that level by raising interest rates or in other ways tightening economic policy, lest inflation get out of control and you have to jack up interest rates to recession-inducing levels in order to bring it back down again. But in the United States, over the past 2 or 3 decades, that threshold of what represents full employment or the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment appears to have moved significantly lower. For example, in the past decade, wages growth never exceeded 2.5% per annum in the US until the unemployment rate dropped below 4%. And this almost certainly reflects significant changes in the way the labour market operates. Workers know as a result of globalisation that they're competing not just with other unemployed workers in the United States, but with workers in other countries, many of whom are quite happy to work for a lot less than workers in advanced economies are, and that they're competing as a result of technological change with robots and computers and algorithms. Employers know that they face much greater resistance from their own customers to price increases as an attempt to recoup the cost of higher wages. So employers have become less willing to concede wage increases than they have before. And of course, there have been some quite significant regulatory and legal changes to the framework within which employers and employees bargain over pay and conditions of employment that have very much tilted the balance of power away from employees towards employers over that period. And as a result, in the US most recently, it wasn't until the unemployment rate had been 3 point something for the best part of 2 years before wages growth in the US started to accelerate, as you can see from the chart on the left. Here in Australia, experience points very much to the same conclusion. We used to regard here in Australia, at least since the late 1990s, that the lowest you could get the unemployment rate to before inflation started to accelerate in an undesirable way was somewhere around 5%. And Australian workers were probably shielded from some of the secular forces suppressing wages growth in the US and other countries that I just talked about by the mining boom of 2005 to 2013, because during that period, many employers on the east coast of Australia found that they needed to be more willing to give their employees a pay rise, lest they nick off to the Pilbara or to the central Queensland coalfields, where much higher pay was on offer. But since the end of the mining boom, Australian workers and the Australian labour market has clearly been exposed to exactly the same forces that have been suppressing wages growth in other countries. And as a result, the Reserve Bank and the Treasury, and now even the political level of government, recognise that the level of unemployment at which wages growth starts to accelerate is much lower than had previously been thought. It might even be, according to the Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank, 3 point something, maybe not less than 3% as I've written there, but certainly less than 4% could be the full employment rate of unemployment. And as I mentioned before, as a result of the recognition of this, for the first time in 20 years, both monetary and fiscal policy are targeting full employment and defining full employment as less than 5%. And during the first half of the previous decade, that is between 2001 and 2008, you had the Reserve Bank gradually tightening monetary policy because they were worried about rising inflation. But you had the Howard government giving away repeated rounds of income tax cuts and cash handouts to various parts of the electorate. You had fiscal and monetary policy working at cross purposes. And then when the coalition returned to government in 2013, they, in pursuit of the goal of a budget surplus, were tightening fiscal policy while the Reserve Bank was intermittently cutting interest rates, that is, easing monetary policy. With fiscal and monetary policy working at cross purposes, it's no wonder, with the benefit of hindsight, that once the mining boom came to an end, the Australian economy was stagnating, with economic growth of barely more than 2%, unemployment unable to fall below about 5.25%, and both wage and price inflation falling well short of the Reserve Bank's target of between 2 and 3%. The fact that we've now got fiscal and monetary policy aiming at the same target, working in harmony rather than at cross purposes, in my view, makes it much more likely that we're actually going to get there. Now, I should say in passing that what I think is still a weakness of economic policy settings is the belief that small business is the so-called engine room of the economy, and that all you have to do is give small business subsidies and tax breaks and look after them in other ways, and everything will be peachy. That's simply not true, despite the fact that genuflection at the altar of small business is not something that's confined to the coalition. Labor politicians do it almost as much as coalition MPs do. ABS surveys tell us that small businesses are still not particularly keen on increasing the size of their workforce. It's medium businesses, that is those between 20 and 200 employees in particular, who are keenest on increasing employment. But large businesses also are more than twice as keen as increasing employment as small businesses are. You know, it's never really been true that small business is the engine room of job creation in Australia. For all that people say that small business employs more than 40% of the workforce, the reality is that over the last 12 years, small business hasn't created a single job on net. Obviously, individual small businesses have, but in aggregate, small business has been a job destroyer, and all the employment growth that's occurred in Australia over the last 12 years in the private sector has been in medium and large businesses. Likewise, small business is less likely to engage in innovation of any sort than medium-sized or large businesses. So we'd have a better chance of achieving our employment objectives if we dropped this small business fetishism, as I call it, and stopped thinking that operating a small business is somehow more noble than working for a big one or working for a government agency or a not-for-profit if we want to see employment growth generate. What small business is particularly good at, in my view, is not paying tax. For all the attention that's given to people at the top end of town, big companies and rich folks not paying their fair share, in inverted commas, of tax, tax office figures themselves show that almost half the personal and company income tax that they don't collect because of non-compliance is not collected from small business. That may be in part, of course, because the tax office is much more vigilant in ensuring compliance by big businesses and high net worth individuals. But nonetheless, it seems to me perverse that the reward for small business for not paying their fair share of tax is that they legitimately get to pay a lower rate of tax than bigger businesses. And again, it would be helpful if we didn't behave in that way. I just want to conclude now by talking, and I'm going to have to do this more quickly than I'd intended, about some other changes that I think COVID will bring in the way that people work. You know, recessions always have lasting consequences, even if the recessions themselves are fairly short. They will sometimes accelerate trends that were underway anyway, such as, in this case, digitization, the growth in online shopping, declining use of cash, the extension of mass surveillance and government controls on what people can do. There are some other trends that the COVID recession has slowed. There are, I think, two pre-existing trends that have been reversed by COVID recession, which go to the faith that people have in the capacity of governments to solve problems and the purported evils of debt and deficit. But I think two trends that COVID is going to have set in place that will last are the greater tendency to work from home, and as we're seeing today, the greater use of technology to undertake things that used to require us to gather in the same place, such as attending conferences. And researchers in the United States have done a lot of work illustrating the proportion of jobs that can be done remotely rather than compelling a physical attendance in the office. Here's one study by Vanguard, a leading US fund manager, that suggests that around 15% of all occupations in the United States, all jobs, could be done remotely. Here's a more detailed survey by McKinsey that suggests that up to 20% of the US workforce could work remotely between 3 and 5 days a week, with no loss of productivity compared with if they were working in an office. And obviously that applies to white collar occupations much more than it does, for example, the blue collar or pink collar occupations, which is an important point we shouldn't lose sight of. But it nonetheless does suggest that both employers and employees are going to be more willing to hire workers remotely than has been the case in most of the post-industrial era. Here's another study, which I'm not going to run through in detail here, which highlights, however, that this is something that both employers and employees are likely to see as a lasting change, bringing potential benefits to both employers and employees and overall to productivity growth. That's US evidence, but the same thing is evident when we look at the Australian situation, where an ABS study that was published about 8 days ago as part of their survey of how business is responding to COVID shows that teleworking has become more commonplace in a wide range of industries, not just office jobs, but also in industries like mining and manufacturing and in wholesale trade, and that a significant proportion of employers expect at least some of those changes to be permanent. Or at least to last for a long period of time. And again, I emphasize that that's over a quite broad range of industries. There are potential upsides and downsides from all of this. One of the most obvious gain from the prospect of more people working from home is a reduction in the amount of time spent commuting. That is, sitting almost still on freeways and arterial roads or in public transport, which gives some people the opportunity to spend more time actually working, but for most of us, more time to spend with partners or families or engaged in a variety of recreational pursuits. And as a side benefit, that also implies reductions in transport carbon emissions. For employers, there are likely to be savings in office accommodation costs, bearing in mind that many employers are going to face increased costs of creating COVID-safe workplaces. So that's not insignificant from an employer perspective. There'll be savings in other time and costs, including, for example, those associated with going to and attending conferences and marketing trips and the like. And importantly, the prospect of working from home will enable employers to access a broader and more diverse workforce than they could if they confined their recruiting efforts to people who live within a commuting distance of wherever their principal premises are. But there are also some important disadvantages to acknowledge. There's the potential loss of productivity arising from distractions in the home environment or from greater difficulties in facilitating collaboration among existing employee teams, although the evidence of that to date is fairly limited. Perhaps more important is the potential loss of innovation and productivity gains that arise from either planned or serendipitous encounters among people who work for different firms, or indeed even in different industries, the so-called network effects that research shows does result in greater productivity gains in concentrated urban areas, in our CBDs in particular. Two other important consequences which I think may be relevant to people who are attending this conference today. Working from home will probably diminish the scope for worker mobility between different employers. And that's important because research shows that one of the most important ways in which workers in general, but particularly younger employees, get pay rises is by moving from one employer to another who's more willing to pay than an existing employer is likely to grant a pay rise to someone who saves on their staff. The second thing that's employment that is important for younger people is that while working from home can work for people who already know who their colleagues are, and having those networks helps people change jobs in pursuit of either new opportunities or higher pay. If you aren't there in the first place, if you're a new entrant to the workforce because you've just completed your education, or if you're re-entering work after an extended period of caring for children or elderly relatives, or of course, if you're an overseas migrant coming to Australia and looking for work for the first time, getting into those networks when you're not physically present is much harder to do than if you're physically present and know the people you're dealing with and have established networks that you can exploit for those and other purposes. So while I think there's a lot of potential upside from what I think is likely to be a sustained increase in the proportion of people working remotely, there are some downsides as well, which may be more significant for young people and others more marginally affiliated to the workforce than has been the case, than might be the case for everyone. I'm going to gloss over this quickly, except to make the point that while there's a lot of discussion around, including among people who are represented here at this conference today, about the rise of the gig economy and the decline in security of employment, it's very hard to find statistical evidence that backs that up. If we look at the trends shown in these charts, for example, the proportion of people who have been working with their employer for relatively short periods has actually gone down over time, as has the proportion of people who expect to be working with the same employer for a short period of time. Whereas the proportion of people who've been working with employers for long periods has actually gone up. Or to take a different perspective, there was a significant increase in the proportion of the workforce defined as casual, that is, without any form of paid leave entitlement, between the early 80s and the early years of this century. But since about 2003-4, that number has been either stable or, during COVID at least, fell significantly because the greater job losses among casual employees. Similarly, if you look at the proportion of the workforce who are classified as owner-managers of unincorporated enterprises with no employees, which includes people like me, but also includes Deliveroo drivers and Uber drivers and people doing that sort of work, the so-called gig economy, well, that's actually has been a declining proportion of the workforce as well. So I think the suggestion that employment has become less secure, while I acknowledge that it's a belief that's widely held, is one that actually is hard to verify by reference to any of the statistical evidence. I want to conclude on this note that Australia's run of almost 30 years without recession and the significant improvement in our material living standards compared with that of many other nations over the last 30 years has relied to a much greater extent than people realise on simply more people working more hours. Between the early 90s recession and the onset of the global financial crisis, roughly speaking, half our growth in real GDP came from increased labour input and half came from productivity growth. In fact, it was a bit more than half from productivity growth and a bit less than half from increased labour inputs. But in the 5 years prior to the onset of the pandemic, that is from the end of the mining boom until the onset of the pandemic, almost 3/4 of what growth in real GDP we had came simply from more people working more hours, and barely more than 1/4 of it came from productivity growth. If we're to sustain growth in our material living standards at the rates that I think we've become accustomed to, and while I'm emphasising material living standards in that context, there are very strong connections between people's material living standards and their capacity to afford to do other things that don't get measured in measures of real GDP. So I would actually say living standards more broadly than simply real GDP per head. If we're to sustain the sort of growth in material and other measures of living standards that we've come to expect, we're going to have to do much better on the productivity growth than we have done, especially if we do actually succeed in getting the unemployment rate down to 4% or less, and we keep our borders closed, or even if we open them, we don't wish to take in as many migrants as we had been doing for the previous 20 years. So I hope that's given everyone lots of things to think about. Ben, I hope I haven't exceeded my time by too much, and thank you very much again for the opportunity to share all these thoughts with you. And I better stop sharing my screen.
Bravo. Thank you, Sol. Absolutely insightful and enlightening. I myself have a couple of questions, probably because I'm a bit of a data nerd, but I'm going to hold them over to the panel towards the end of today's discussion. But that was absolutely fantastic. Because we are pushing for time, I am going to move straight over to our next presenter. Emma Dawson will be joining us from Per Capita, talking about the coming of age in a crisis, young workers, COVID-19, and the youth guarantee. Emma Dawson is Executive Director of Public Policy think tank Per Capita. She has worked as a researcher at Monash University and the University of Melbourne in policy and public affairs for SBS and Telstra, and as a senior policy advisor in the Rudd and Gillard governments. Emma has published reports and articles, including being the co-author of Per Capita's landmark report, Measure for Measure, Gender Equality in Australia, and co-editor with Professor Janet McMahon of a collection of essays, What Happens Next? Reconstructing Australia After COVID-19, published by the Melbourne University Press. Please welcome Emma, and I'm handing over to you.
Thank you, Ben, and hello, everybody. It's good to be with you today. And thank you, Saul, for that very informative presentation. I'd just like to start by saying that I'm coming to you from the lands of the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation here in Melbourne, in the Bayside suburbs of Melbourne, still not back in the office as yet, and pay my respect to their elders past and present, and wherever you are, I'm sure you'll join me in acknowledging that we are on Aboriginal land that was never ceded. I'm in an unusual position today of presenting a report that was authored by someone else. So actually my former colleague, Shirley Jackson, wrote and released this paper for Per Capita last year, Coming of Age in a Crisis, and has just in the last month taken up a new role as Head of Government Relations for the Foundation for Young Australians. So he'll be in that role, I'm sure, advocating very strongly for a lot of the ideas and policy prescriptions that we worked on together while he was here with me at Per Capita. So what did we do with this paper? and I did work with Shirley on it to some extent. It's part of a suite of policy papers and policy interventions that we at Per Capita have been developing now for some years to effectively try to create a framework in which Australian governments could push for a full employment economy. And as Saul has noted, and I won't go over that ground too much, but it has been pleasing in the last couple of weeks to see that we do finally have a commitment to addressing employment and to focusing on employment rather than inflation through both monetary and fiscal policy settings. And the Treasurer's announcement that he was eschewing austerity measures and focusing on driving the unemployment rate down is a very good message. We at Per Capita believe that full employment probably does sit somewhere between 2.5 and 3.5%. And when we talk about full employment, we're not just talking about achieving a rate of employment that would push wages up and kick into effect inflation. But genuine full employment, that means that everybody who is able and willing to work has the opportunity to do so. There will remain some frictional levels of unemployment in the system as people move between jobs, and certainly compared to the measures of full employment that were understood in the post-war years, under the Chifley and Menzies governments up until the 1970s, full employment at that time was understood to be less than 2%. I think the changed conditions of our labour market now mean that it is likely higher than that, but it's certainly a long way down from where we are now. To focus on the issues of coming of age in a crisis and how this relates to youth employment, regardless of the fact that we are experiencing a quicker return than predicted to job restoration and economic recovery after the COVID, we do still see a youth unemployment rate in the double figures across the country. Last month it was around 13%. And in parts of regional Australia, of course, it's higher again. But that just masks, and I think one of the really important points we're making here is it's not just about the headline unemployment rate. One of the things that has really plagued young workers in Australia since the GFC has been underutilisation. And when we talk about the changes in the labour market, we're really talking about that a job ain't a job. It's not what it used to be. Underemployment, in which people are not obtaining enough hours or as many hours as they need to provide them with a living income, is a significant and growing problem in the Australian economy. And again, it's affecting younger people particularly harshly. We know that at the height of the crisis last year, more than 250,000 of young people between the age of 15 and 24 dropped out of the labour force altogether. The jobs they were working in hospitality or retail or tourism just disappeared, and we saw higher levels of enrolment in education, which is what tends to happen during a recession, is younger people will stay in education longer. But we know that on top of those about 250,000 that dropped out of the workforce last year, we now have we had a true youth underutilisation rate 6 months ago of around about 60%. So meaning that 60% of people between 15 and 34 in the labour force were looking for more work. Even before this crisis hit, this was a systemic problem for young workers in Australia, and it predates the GFC, but it's certainly exacerbated since that point in time. So that prior to COVID hitting, we had about half of those aged between 15 and 24 working casually. That's not that unusual for that age group. Many of them are engaged in study. But that casualisation and precarity, as we call it in the labour force, is sticking into the later years much more so than it did in previous generations. So that about 40% of those aged between 25 and 34 before COVID were also employed on an either casual basis or on a fixed term or part-time contract. This level of underemployment and of underutilisation has pernicious impacts on people's ability to then build a career and to build economic security throughout their life. And we know that having 500,000 unemployed people for more than 12 months now, so 500,000 people in the labour force who are long-term unemployed, that's at the highest rate it's been in a quarter of a century. So we have this persistent problem of people not having enough work, not being in work for longer periods of time, interrupting their careers quite early on, or finding it harder to get onto the career ladder in the first place, which can delay, obviously, and have a negative effect on their earnings over a lifetime. At the same time, we're seeing generations with much higher levels of student debt. So when the HECS system was introduced in the late 1980s, it was introduced on the premise that obtaining a university degree gave a person higher purchase in the labour market. It meant that they were likely to earn more over their lifetime because of the benefits afforded to them by that degree. And so the repayments for HECS were set at a rate and to kick in when the salaries of people who had graduated university reflected that wage premium that had come from getting their degree. That contract has been broken over recent years, so that we now have much higher levels of HECS debt for vocational and for tertiary courses, but we also have them kick in to be repaid at a much lower level. So the rate of earnings at which you now have to start repaying that HECS debt are only about $45,000 a year, which is not much higher than the full-time minimum wage. So that contract that if you paid something towards your degree, you would benefit and you wouldn't have to pay it back until you saw the benefit of that educational premium, has really been eroded over time. So we have people working well into their 30s in casualised jobs, often in industries like retail and hospitality that they don't intend to build a lifelong career in, and saddled with the kind of debt for a degree that is meant to have got them into the job that they wanted a career in, that they still don't have. This delay in their ability to find full-time work, to get the kind of employment that they intended to get when they enrolled in their degree, to build a career, then has, as I said, pernicious effects across the life course. It delays their ability to get into the housing market, and that comes with a whole new set of problems due to the escalation in property prices. It delays their ability to start a family and to build economic security. And that then will track through the life course to mean that as these generations approach older age, middle age and retirement, they have fewer savings. They are more likely to retire with mortgage debt or without ever having owned a house in the first place. They are likely to have lower superannuation balances than was predicted back in the 1990s. And so their economic security is likely to be declining in terms of comparison to their parents and even grandparents' generations in some extent. We certainly have higher living standards than we did across the board in the 1950s and 1960s, but to some extent the way that those are very finely balanced and precarious now puts a lot more pressure on young people. One of the things Saul talked about a lot there was the nature of the labour market and the impact on unemployment and employment growth and on economic growth of our closed borders. And this is something that really ties in with what Shirley did in this report, which was to look at the way that private enterprise, small, medium and large business, now engage with young people and with employees as they come into their firms. We have had now for 25 years a situation in which, rather than encouraging investment in skills training and education amongst their own domestic workforce, we have filled those skills gaps by bringing in temporary migrants. Now, migration has been an unequivocal good for this country. Other than First Nations people, we are all immigrants to some extent, and immigrants do, as Saul said, contribute to economic growth, they contribute to demand in the economy, they bring skills and they bring economic activity often to regions that otherwise wouldn't be there. The problem that we've had, and that's been exacerbated over recent years, is that rather than have a migration program that brings in people on a permanent basis or with a pathway to permanent residency and citizenship so that they can build a life as well, we're bringing in people to fill skills gaps on a temporary basis, which means they have no promise of being able to build a life in Australia. And they are often the most exploited workers in our economy because often their visa conditions are tied to them holding the job that they're employed to do when they come into the country. That means that their employers have a great deal more power over them than they would with a domestic worker who can walk away from that job without the fear of deportation. And so in a way that holds wages down for those workers, and it means that they are very exploited. What it means for young people in Australia is a distinct lack of long and medium term planning and investment in their skills and abilities. So where once in the 1950s and 60s, where we did have full employment, we also had a really effective effective system of tertiary and vocational education, the TAFE system, and employers working with those systems to allow young people to engage in training on the job, to invest in their own workforce development, we now have a situation in which employers effectively expect their workers to turn up fully trained and fully ready to work. And if they're not, there are all kinds of complaints about a lack of available workers. And we're seeing this now emerge really strongly in some of those sectors that were very hard hit during COVID. So in recent days, we've heard complaints from people in the retail and hospitality sector, in particular tourism and hospitality in regional Australia, saying they can't get workers, they can't get qualified chefs, they can't get qualified carers in some caring professions. And that's because we have relied on temporary migrants who are no longer, at the moment, coming into the country. The lead time for investing in the skills training for local people to do that work is not going to meet the needs of those immediate demands in those labour forces and those sectors of the economy right now. It's a 3-year TAFE course to become qualified as a chef, for example, and it's at least a 12-month Cert 3 qualification to be able to work as a child carer or an aged carer. And these are jobs that are growing, that aren't automated, but that are very insecure and are very underpaid. Now, this isn't necessarily a new phenomenon. As Saul said, Australia has gone 30 years really without experiencing a technical recession until the onset of COVID. I myself graduated university during the recession we had to have in the early 90s, mid-90s, and it was certainly very difficult then to get a job in what I intended to do, and took me probably the better part of 6 or 7 years. But that time's now blown out for young people, so that they're now looking at into their 30s and early 30s before they're able to get a job that's connected to their qualifications. And this, as Shirley shows in the report, differs according to what those qualifications are. So if you have qualifications in health, in IT, in a lot of engineering and other vocational professions, then you're more likely to be employed in a field related to your tertiary education in your 20s than you are if you have some of the more soft skills in, for example, humanities and social sciences, that many Australian graduates have. That's simply because of a lack of career pathways and a lack of that ability of government to work with business to understand what the skills needs are. Although we know that a lot of the jobs of the future will actually rely on the skills that are achieved through humanities and arts degrees. So the focus on STEM, science, technology, engineering and maths is important, but I think a shift to a focus that we're calling for to STEAM, which includes arts in there, will recognise the value of those degrees in a future employment market. Now, when millennials came of age, effectively, we weren't looking at a formal or a technical recession in the GFC, but the GFC still had a massive impact on the life prospects and the employment prospects of people that entered the labour force, were in their early to mid-20s when the GFC hit about 13 years ago. And we've seen a long tail now, really, of the changed nature of the labour market and what Shirley in his report called the new normal for younger workers post-GFC. This isn't, again, unique to Australia. It's a phenomenon we've seen occur in most developed nations, and even though Australia was not just fortunate but clever enough to avoid a technical recession, the impact here has been similar as it has been in other parts of the world, in that 13 years after that GFC hit, we have seen that growth in insecure jobs, in temporary jobs. Permanent jobs are harder to come by, full-time jobs are harder to come by. And so we have seen in the wake of that GFC, well before COVID hit, that the extension of a kind of youth well into the 30s, not through any choice of young people, but because of their inability to get the kind of permanent, secure work that their parents and grandparents were able to get in their 20s, because of the changed nature of the labour market. This means that they postpone, as I said, all of the trappings of adulthood and makes it much harder for them to build economic security across the life course. The skills mismatch that we are seeing across the country now, and that is becoming really acute since we've seen temporary migration on hold, is only going to continue if we don't think more cleverly and more creatively about how we support young people to build that career and to establish the kind of economic security that previous generations have taken for granted. Now, in tonight's budget, we are seeing some announcements about training and skills training for Australians out of work. But as usual, they seem to be, and the devil will be in the detail tonight, but from what we've seen so far, they do seem to be tied to quite punitive measures through the job active employment system, so that rather than taking a proactive or encouraging approach of working with young people to say, what are the skills that you need addressing and how can we help to do that and how can we work with business to do that, it is more a stick approach than a carrot, in that if people do not sign up for training courses when jobs aren't available, they will have their income reduced or removed. This punitive approach has been really damaging actually to a lot of young people, and we now have a situation in which the long-term unemployed, which has traditionally been older people that have been thrown out of work during a recession, that long-term unemployment and certainly sticky underemployment is sticking at a much younger age. A lot of the previous programs the government has introduced to support jobs growth for young people have not succeeded. So prior to COVID, we had things like the PATH internship program, which was again very ineffective at actually getting people into permanent and secure jobs, and was much more likely to be used to put people on to temporary and casual positions in retail and hospitality that would already have been filled. And similarly, the job maker hiring credit, which was designed to do exactly the same thing effectively, to help retail and hospitality put people back into work after the recession, but was focused on people under 35 and was a direct wage subsidy, was a failure. It was intended to create 450,000 jobs. It's created less than 1,000, and that money's now being repurposed. It's critically important that we don't continue to do the same thing and focus on the wrong side of this equation. And most of what governments in recent years and decades have done have looked at the wrong side of the equation. They have tended to say, well, we need to put more pressure on young people to find work. We need to make it harder for them to get income support so that they'll feel pressured into finding work. We need to give money to employers to encourage them to hire people, but without the appropriate strings attached, so that after the subsidy disappears, often the job disappears with it. What Per Capita is proposing as part of our full employment program, and that Shirley's paper of coming of age in a crisis really flagged, was the development of an Australian model for a youth guarantee. This is not the same thing as a jobs guarantee, which is often talked about in modern monetary theory circles, or the Green New Deal. It is specifically aimed at younger people and their entry into work, their transition between education and employment, and how to set them up for a secure lifetime of work. And it is based on some Nordic models of youth guarantees that Shirley and others, and myself now as well, at Per Capita, have been looking at in detail to understand how they work. We can't just import overseas models into Australia. It's critically important to understand the different nature of our population, that we are a country of immigrants, we're a multicultural country, we have significant landmass and a small population, relatively speaking. We have distinct skills gaps differences between cities and regions, and we have a different industrial base to a lot of European countries, where we don't any longer have, for example, a lot of jobs in skilled or advanced manufacturing. We tend to rely much more on services jobs and on the export of resources, although that is another area that we do believe needs to change, and that is another focus of our full employment program. The pillars of a youth guarantee, and I'm mindful I've only got a few minutes left, there are 4 essential pillars here. The first is publicly funded post-secondary education and training. And we see an example of how this can work here in Victoria over the last couple of years with their free TAFE programs that have provided essentially free TAFE education to people that are training in areas of identified skills gaps in the Victorian economy. The second pillar is study and training income support at a living wage. So rather than asking young people under the age of 24 who are engaged in study to live on youth allowance, which is even lower than the job seeker rate, and job seeker itself is only now $620 a fortnight, that we actually provide people with enough money to allow them to concentrate on their training, to understand the way that their vocational goals match up with their education. We're not saying that people at university age shouldn't have to work at all, but certainly the pressure now on young people who are engaged in education and training to earn money on top of a living allowance, and the restricted criteria to be eligible for that living allowance means that many young people are simply not able to dedicate as much time and thought to their education as even my generation was in the 1990s. So an increase in income support is an important part of the guarantee. The third pillar is creating an increased demand for entry-level positions. And when we talk about entry-level positions, we're talking about something very different than casual short-term jobs. There will always be the need in all industries for people that want to work in those industries long-term, but there at the moment is a high concentration of younger people working in jobs in retail and hospitality who never intended to make that sector their career. So we need, as well as those jobs that are very important to the domestic economy, to household consumption, and to providing work for people that don't perhaps want to work full-time and want to fit their work around caring responsibilities, particularly parents. We need entry-level positions in career industries in which young people can get a foothold, perhaps while they're still training and while they're still undergoing education, and to build a career from those entry-level positions. And then the fourth, and perhaps to me the most important part of this youth guarantee policy and the way it would change what we have now, is to radically reform employment services systems across this country, to stop them being punitive, to stop them being used as a means to encourage people off income support, whether they've got a job or not, and to be directly engaged with young workers, identifying where the skills shortages are, being able to work with business, particularly local business in regional areas, to understand the skills gaps and work very effectively as a coordinating body that can help people understand not only where the jobs are, but what the appropriate access avenues and training are to get there. So some detail on what this would look like. Yes, we would like to see a bigger investment in free TAFE linked to skills gaps across the country in all states. Significant reformation or reform of the HEC system to take it back to its original purpose, by which people are not being expected to pay tens of thousands of dollars over 15 or 20 years for a degree that has not actually helped them get a job or have an income premium. A big increase in graduate programs across the public sector and the private sector, and apprenticeships and traineeships, not just those that are focused on typically male blue-collar jobs, but also those that employ young women into professions that don't necessarily need a tertiary degree, but a vocationally and traineeship field. And how graduate programs and training can look in the private sector, which would include measures around perhaps tax incentives or training levies to encourage private business to actually invest in the skills of our own young people rather than just relying on temporary migration. Using government and social procurement policies to build in requirements for young people to be given those entry-level and traineeship opportunities on government projects. And as I said, significant reform of the employment services system. While there is some money apparently in tonight's budget for the current Job Active network to provide additional digital skills and what they call foundational skills in literacy and numeracy, these are not actually what's needed for young people. They are important, perhaps, certainly important later in life. There are many workers in midlife and later life who will lose a job as a result of this recession and find it very difficult to get back into the workforce because they may not have the appropriate digital skills or even literacy skills that allow them to compete in the modern workforce. That's not such a big issue for younger workers, as they tend to have come from school, and when they've been engaged in that kind of training, what they actually need is significant active labour market programs. So abolishing work for the dole, abolishing the CDP that's very damaging in remote Indigenous communities, and actually investing in programs that provide real work experience, real skills, and a living income while doing so, with a pathway to long-term employment. So as I said, this is a paper that we put out in June last year. You'll be able to find it on our website, but it's part of a bigger and ongoing project to look at how we can smooth the transition from education to employment for young Australians, but how we can also create real jobs with a real potential of providing secure lifelong income. We're not expecting predicting that we'll return to a world where people started their job at 16 and stayed in the same workforce or same workplace until they were retired at 60 or 65. But there's certainly a happy medium between that and where we are now, where young people can often be combining 2 or 3 part-time and casual jobs well into their 30s in order just to meet their cost of living. And that's before you even look at investing in longer term security. We are currently undertaking a co-design project in the western suburbs of Melbourne on the Youth Guarantee, which is really generously supported by the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation. And through that, we're going to answer some of the questions that arise in a very local context when we try to bring in policy ideas that have been tried and tested in other countries to see how they will work here on the ground. And all of this ongoing work, as I said, forms part of our full employment reconstruction program, which, while we are glad to hear, as I said, some of the rhetoric towards employment changing, we are still engaged very heavily in the process of putting meat on those policy bones and really trying to change the trajectory that has been available to young people since the GFC back towards one that values their skills and their ability to contribute over a lifetime. So I'll leave it there because we're over time, but thank you.
Bravo. Thank you so much, Emma. On behalf of Shirley, you did an incredibly marvellous job of articulating the benefits of what a youth guarantee could look like. And I think something that we'll attempt to explore a little bit later on the panel is the benefits of the living working wage. And something that I'm particularly interested about is how we promote greater job opportunities and entry-level positions for young people. So marvellous. Absolutely fantastic. Okay, so folks, we are now going to take a very short break. I thank Emma for sticking her best to time, which means we're going to come back in just over 7 minutes, 1:40. We'll be welcoming Keith, our final speaker, before we kick off the panel discussion. So head off to the bathroom, make a cup of coffee or tea or whatever it is that you drink, and please be back ready for the next session at 1:40. Thank you. Okay, welcome back, everybody. It's been a very lively first two key presentations, thanks to Saul and Emma, and looking forward to our final, as we're about to be joined by Keith. I think a couple of things that have stuck out for me that I'm really interested in exploring on the final panel session this afternoon is the real or perceived correlation between the impact of the rise of the gig economy and that of job security. I hadn't seen the data or the statistics as presented by Saul, so that'll be interesting and something for us to explore a little later. But as interested am I on the youth guarantee and how we can really support young people to make the best transition from school to work. But without any further ado, we are joined by our final presenter of the afternoon, Keith Waters. Keith has worked in the not-for-profit sector for over 30 years. He has held executive positions with Anglicare in New South Wales and the ACT, as well as the Salvation Army here in Melbourne, where I am. He has experience across a wide range of areas, including youth, drug and alcohol, housing and homelessness, crisis services, out-of-home care, family violence, the list goes on, Keith, prisons and courts, disability services, childcare, aged care, primary health care and juvenile justice. In addition to leading a non-government organisation as an executive, he has pioneered numerous innovative programs for disadvantaged young people for over 20 years and has been the author and co-author of a number of landmark reports which have impacted youth policy. He is currently the Executive Officer of both YDA and the National Youth Commission into Youth Employment and Transitions. Keith has postgraduate qualifications in innovation, service management, and business administration. Please welcome Keith.
Thanks, Ben. Gee, I sound like a bloody dinosaur. 30 years. It's a long time. Look, thanks everyone for joining the session. I'd like to start by just paying my respects to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as the custodians of the land on which we reside. What I hope to do in this session is just make some introductory remarks and then really to focus in on the work of the National Youth Commission over the last 2 years and the evidence that the Commission has collected, and to give you sort of a broad overview of that and then focus in a little bit more on employment services and what we learned from the Commission in relation to employment services. So I want to start by just saying that really the challenges faced by young people in relation to transitioning from education to work and the challenges they face in the labour market are not new. Even before 2020 brought COVID-19 to Australia, it's been increasingly obvious for decades that despite Australia's apparent prosperity, the prospects for young people leaving school and entering the workforce have been steadily worsening. You would be aware that unemployment for young people under the age of 25 has hovered around 13% for nearly 30 years without an effective response from successive governments. So it's not a new problem. We know that 650,000 young people are not in employment, education or training. And it's quite possible that this has grown since the heavy restrictions of COVID. What has changed significantly since particularly the global financial crisis of 07-08 is the increase in reported underemployment for young people, now sitting at about 19%. This government has a really poor track record in addressing the challenges young people face generally, but more specifically in relation to the labour market. And you will all recall that in October last year, the COVID budget, whilst well-intentioned, was misguided in delivering the JobMaker hiring credits and selling it as a major response to the impact on young people. And we all know that that has been an abysmal failure. And this was all but admitted by the Treasurer on the weekend. This also comes on the back of the failed PATH program, which was also announced by this government and only delivered 5,000 of 30,000 jobs it promised to young people. And to be quite frank, the jury is still out on transitions to work. And whilst we heard a lot of anecdotal evidence about the success of transition to work, we've yet to see any quantitative evidence about the outcomes that transition to work is actually achieving. To balance the ledger, though, I think it's probably fair to say that Labor has almost been invisible, I think, on the policy front in respect of what it would do to address youth unemployment and underemployment. So it'll be interesting to see what we see delivered for young people in tonight's budget. We know that there'll be a further commitment to JobTrader, and my concern with that is that, you know, we can train the hell out of young people, but if there's no jobs and no meaningful jobs at the end of it, then, you know, I really throw my hands up and say, what's the point? All right, having said all of that, let me tell you a little bit about the Commission. The National Youth Commission is an independent, non-partisan inquiry, leading really what is an intergenerational community discussion about the challenges faced by young people. And fundamentally, the inquiry asks what needs to change if young people are to have opportunities to get meaningful and secure employment and live lives they have reason to value. And we modelled the work on really the Human Rights Commission's inquiry model, in that we undertook a whole series of public hearings across every capital city and some regional centres. We even held consultations online with some rural towns. But an important part of the Commission's work was we wanted to ensure that by the time we got to the end of the process, we hadn't just consulted with experts or practitioners or services and not heard the voice of any young people. So we were very deliberate about including young people as part of the makeup of the commissioners themselves undertaking the hearings, but we were very deliberate in ensuring that we also consulted with young people. We made a decision early on that we wouldn't go down the path of surveys or questionnaires. I think young people are bloody surveyed out of their minds by now. But really what we wanted to do was to have a deep dive conversation with young people. And that's effectively what we did. We held public hearings across Australia, to which just over 350 individuals and organisations gave evidence or testimony. And along with that, we held over 80 in-depth discussion groups with over 800 young people during that time. Now, last year in August, we released what was our interim findings report based on the work that we'd done. And I don't have time to go into great detail about that now, but you can download that work from our website, nycinquiry.org.au. But what I will do is just touch briefly on what we identified based on the evidence that we gathered were the 9 key areas that we thought or we considered are important policy pillars required for an effective transitional support system for young people. And when we consider transitions, we're not thinking, and we haven't been thinking, just purely about the transition from education to work, because our premise is that young people go through a whole range of transitions, not just a single transition. Now, beyond the sort of basic needs for love and social connection, family and friends, you know, that we all have, including young people, the inquiry found that young people need a number of things around 9 areas. So I just want to go through them quickly. The first is in relation to education and training. The Commission found that really the Australian education and training systems need urgent and major reform. We found that ATAR has really distorted the purpose and experience of secondary education for young people. And we also found, which shouldn't come as news, that VET, including TAFE and VCAL, are poorly resourced and not actively encouraged as genuine pathways in schools. What did alarm us as we travelled the country was that we also found that careers advice on the whole, with a small number of exceptions, was incredibly poor. And there was certainly a significant disconnect between schools and local or regional labour markets, and in particular, a disconnect between schools and employers. We did find some evidence of an emerging focus on enterprise or social enterprise education. And whilst I don't think that's for every kid, it certainly has its place. And we were in particular impressed by the work that the Australian Centre for Rural and Regional Entrepreneurship, led by Matt Follett, was doing in relation to social enterprise education in primary schools. Was quite an impressive thing. But in relation to education and training, what we fundamentally found was that young people need education and training that is meaningful to them and prepares them for a life in the 21st century. And we also found that young people need real and relevant career advice. The second area was in relation to employment. Now, young people face higher levels of unemployment and underemployment than older workers, and young people really value and want meaningful employment, but for many it's difficult to achieve in the changing economy and labour market. We also found that young workers are vulnerable to exploitation in the workforce, and there were far too many examples of that, in particular in relation to wage theft and young people not understanding their rights in the workplace. The lack of employment experience is a major barrier for many young people, really, as they try to get a foothold in the employment of their choice. And we heard time and time again by young people about how difficult it was when they were applying for jobs where basically they were entry-level jobs, but employers were requiring considerable experience for entry-level jobs. And, with how it was almost impossible for them to get that experience because they couldn't get access to the entry-level jobs. We also, and I'll touch on this a little bit later, but employment, we had a lot of evidence about employment services for young people have not really kept up with the realities of the current labour market and are not fit for purpose. And as I said, we'll come back to this. But fundamentally, what we found was that young people need informed choices about employment opportunities that come from exposure to really the world of work and a better understanding of the future of work. And that needs to be combined with meaningful entry-level jobs to get a start in life. The third area that we focused on was around income support. And what we found was that Australia's social security system really is meant to support people of working age by creating pathways to employment, and increasingly it's not fit for purpose. We found that really fundamentally the current system, income support system, was built for another era. It's not built for today. It's not built for the labour market of today, when periods of unemployment, particularly for young people, are constant when they work in a precarious environment. What was also evident was that the rates of youth allowance and job seeker payments without the COVID-19 supplement just fall well short of what's needed to meet the cost of daily living, particularly for young people living away from home, or those who have no parental support. And there were many cases that we heard about of young people who live in real poverty, and this affects their ability to look for work. I was stunned to sort of hear the stories of young people. Dumpster diving is what they call it, diving into dumpsters outside supermarkets, because the income was so inadequate for them. And these were university students as well, that they had to dive into the dumpsters of supermarkets to actually try and retrieve food so that they could eat. The income support system is just far too complex and far too insufficiently flexible to meet the fluctuating needs of income support for young people. And so what we found was that adequate income support when studying and during periods of unemployment, as well as enough to top up their income needs when they are underemployed is really important. And recently we released what we called a youth income guarantee, which is a model that we have tried to put forward as a model that could support young people both in education, in part-time or precarious work, and for those that are underemployed. The fourth area that the Commission explored was in relation to housing for young people. And youth homelessness continues to be a troubling social problem for the nation. There's approximately 43,000 young people aged 15 to 24 homeless on any given night. Only a small proportion of young people can access social housing, and 6 out of 10 young people who get Commonwealth Rent assistance still experience housing stress. So there's an urgent need for housing options specifically designed to support young people who have been homeless. And more broadly, the housing affordability crisis is really a serious barrier to young people's transition to independence. So what we found was that young people need housing that is stable and affordable and close enough to where they work and where they learn and where they can develop social connections. The fifth area that we explored was around mental health. And clearly mental ill health limits success in education, training and employment. Anxiety, stress, depression, they're all prevalent among young people, particularly for young people in contact with the justice system or in remote areas or those in state care. And the risk of self-harm and youth suicide rates is rising. Really, I do not think that we have a great sense of the impact of COVID-19 on the mental health of young people, particularly in those areas where there were harsh lockdowns. And I still think that we're going to see that manifest in a way that we're going to be ill-prepared to address. So what we found again here was that young people really need mental health services that are capable of a timely response to crisis, but also to the early onset of mental health issues. The next area that we focused on was around transport. And whilst this may not be a major issue for young people living in the metropolitan area, it certainly was for those living on the fringes, and especially for those in regional and remote places where transport stress is a real problem. And this arises when public transport is either unaffordable, it's not available, or it's too infrequent to support educational viable travel to work. So this was a significant issue. Cars remain necessary in many situations and are required for some employment. So we found that really young people need transport options that fit with times for work and for learning. The next issue that we explored was around the environment, and I won't go into a great detail about that, apart from saying that we found, just like many other commentators have found, that a sustainable environment and a serious commitment to address climate change is needed. One of the areas that did pop up very strongly through the evidence for us was that there is a sort of slow burning trend towards place-based strategies in contrast to the status quo of programs designed and funded by government departments working in silos. And this programmatic funding approach that we've lived with for years and has created, what I call service land, has not particularly served us well and served young people well. We did find during last year that communities coming to terms with the recovery of COVID-19 have been really well served by taking a renewed interest in a greater community focus. And, we saw examples of where, there were coalitions organised that included schools, vet providers, local business, industry, social services, and even researchers. And excuse me, I've got one of my sons trying to contact me. So there was quite a lot of evidence of the kind of localised design and decision-making that came to the inquiry, and, the Hume Youth Commitment, the Geelong G21 Alliance, and others were examples of this. And I think these ways of working, being referred to more recently as collective impact, are being taken up by more local communities who are inspired, I think, to coordinate efforts and share resources. And the inquiry also learned about missed opportunities when centralised decision-making and policy settings are unable to respond or be harnessed to local plans. And an example of that was, again, well-intentioned, but free TAFE courses in Victoria, which were decided by statewide skills needs rather than really examining what were local or regional needs. And fundamentally, what we found was that young people need to be included in decision making, and that even includes the design of services as well. So some general observations that I just want to make quickly based on the work of the Commission is firstly that there are a range of service systems operating here to support young people's transition, and there is clearly a disconnect between them all. And that disconnect really means that it's difficult for young people to navigate through this convoluted range of systems. We also found that there just continues to be this strong emphasis or onus placed completely on young people to meet the needs of employers, and the frustration they found in that when the demands of employers were difficult to meet. And what we found was that there was just a lack of sense or understanding by employers about what it meant to be a youth-friendly employer. And we really felt that was a significant gap. Along with the evidence that we looked at in our interim findings report, at the same time we released the Youth Futures Guarantee, which was really an attempt to take the evidence that we had gathered and provide, in essence, what was a discussion paper focused around these 9 policy areas. And if you're interested in that, you can download that off our website. nycinquiry.org.au. Now, what I'd like to do is just focus quickly on employment services, which is sort of more interest to yourselves. The Commission really found or was presented with evidence of the failure of the current employment services system to understand and meet the needs of young people in preparing for and gaining meaningful employment. And we found that the system has become sort of a one-size-fits-all standardised service, often delivered by staff who have to manage high caseloads and who often do not have the skills to assist young people with complex needs. And job seekers, are required to, we found we're required to often participate in training and activities unrelated to labour market needs, and that the payment structure for Job Active encourages providers really to churn job seekers through short-term job placements. We also found that sort of the punitive compliance requirements placed on job seekers really creates a tension for workers in Job Active in developing the trusting relationships necessary to provide personalised support and assistance which young people need. So really, in many ways, their hands are tied. And I'm happy to go into more detail about this, but what we found was sort of 8 key areas that related to Job Active that I would just highlight. The first issue is around personalised service. Now, in our view, the systemic problem here is that Job Active on the whole has a very standardised approach. So we think the solution to that is that we think that there should be mandated, individually tailored case plans within a comprehensive case management framework to address that issue. The second issue that we identified was around caseload sizes, and the systemic problem here is around high and unmanageable caseloads on workers. And we believe the solution to that is that contracts should stipulate maximum caseload sizes. The third issue that we identified was around sustainable placements. And again, the systemic problem we identified was the churning through of short-term placements. And so we think the way to address that is to incentivise long-term placements. The fourth area we identified, we think about is service ethos. And again, we found that the systemic problem was around profit motivation. And we think we need to get back to developing sort of a public service ethos. That is, we're delivering a service to the public, and that there should be a limitation put on profit taking by providers. The fifth area that we looked at with employment services was around the engagement of young people. And the systemic problem here is around punitive compliance-based approach that's taken. And our sort of response to that is that, we need to reform mutual obligation and replace punitive requirements with positive reinforcement approach to engaging young people. The sixth area was around staff retention and skill development within Job Active. And the systemic problem here is really around limited skill set and high staff turnover. And so we think the response needs to be that, we require providers to enhance the training and skill levels of staff to enable them to work effectively with young people with complex needs. The seventh issue that we identified was around consultation with key stakeholders. And employment services are designed to comply with, a pretty prescriptive process-driven contract. But we believe fundamentally that what needs to be implemented is a co-designed approach focusing on people-centred service delivery. And then last but not least is labour market interventions. And the systemic problem here is that training and interventions unrelated to labour market needs. So we're pushing for the establishment of local labour market councils, really to try and bring stakeholders together, including young people, to drive appropriate skills training and relevant interventions. Look, that's a quick summary of both our findings and some of our conclusions and some of the solutions that we're proposing. And Ben, I'm happy to take any questions.
I am on mute, the saying of the decade, as it were. Thanks so much, Keith. That was really interesting. I might just jump in with a quick question. You were talking earlier around the disconnect between schools and local skill shortages, and then you just started talking about the potential establishment of local labour market councils. What would that look like? What would they do? Who would be involved?
Well, we did see some examples, but they were few and far between, and often they were in regional communities where schools, employers, small and large, vet providers, transition to work providers, young people, really all came together and looked at what were the industry needs in that area, looked at how it is that employers and vet providers could be better connected to secondary schools, where there could be better resourcing in terms of vet and VCAL in schools, and trying to underscore that as a legitimate pathway for those young people that don't want to pursue a career, a tertiary career, or through the tertiary system. But it was about a coming together, an approach that is referred to as collective impact, where you bring stakeholders together. You look at the data for that area so that you have a good both quantitative and qualitative sense about what is needed, and you actively engaged all stakeholders, including young people, what solutions were or what responses were determined did not leave young people out of the picture. That's absolutely critical, because far too often you can get these stakeholders come together, and the principal stakeholder, young people, is missed out, and it's absolutely vital.
Yeah, I do still find it quite interesting and baffling sometimes that young people seem to be left till last in the consultation or engagement process as opposed to first. They generally should be involved in the decision making. I've got another question for you, Keith. This comes from Bella Ainsworth. Keith, do you think that there is a way government or organisations can support place-based approaches and responses better?
Yeah, I do. I use the term service land because I think really sort of, the marketisation of vet, the competitive tendering process that the whole not-for-profit sector works in, not just the not-for-profit sector, but the private sector too works in, has really, and I'll refer to the not-for-profit sector mainly because that's the one I work in. It has driven us all into our shells. It has driven us all to have a focus around the growth of our service, the growth of our organisation, the profile of our CEO. And, quite frankly, I've been in the sector long enough. I'm just absolutely amazed about how CEOs now become celebrities almost. We have this use of CEOs' profiles and the building of organisations. And so really, we've been forced to that to a degree, but we've also taken a bit of that on. And I think, real collective impact happens when organisations say, okay, this is not about us and it's not about the profile of our organisation. It's about the young person. There are bigger issues at play than our service or our organisation, and we need to join this bigger effort to try and develop some real responses. And that could well mean, and I've seen some examples of it, that could well mean organisations actually giving up some of their resources in order to make a larger impact.
Yeah, it's a really interesting premise, I think, as we've seen the non-profit sector be pushed towards a more competitive tendering environment that, we sometimes end up in our own silos. So a really, really good and interesting thought there. I'm just having a look. I've got one more question before we go to the break, but it seems to be a long one. So if you don't mind bearing with me, Keith, and you'll understand this a little.
Is this from Daniel?
I haven't seen the one from Daniel, but this one is around the CDP program. So the CDP program is compulsory for registered First Nations Australians over the age of 18 years old. Many young Indigenous Australian people cease attending school up to 5 or more years prior to that and somehow learn to survive without any program or structure. By the time these young people are 18, employment programs are more often than not irrelevant. So the question is, do you have any thoughts on what and how might be proposed to better suit these most vulnerable young people?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's not only, I think, a question for around First Nations young people, although that is absolutely, it's a really important issue. We found that it's also, a quickly emerging issue for new arrivals and young people from African nations, where our education system and our employment services has no sense of where these young people are at in terms of foundational education, and have no idea about how to engage them in relation to both education and employment. And look, it might sound sort of simplistic, but one of the things that we're strongly banging on about is that if we're going to continue to design policies and programs without effectively engaging young people, whether they be Indigenous young people, whether they be young people from African nations or young people generally, if we do not engage them in developing the responses that they need, that they feel they need, then we're really going to miss the mark. So I suppose that's my key message, is that young people have got to be included as part of the co-design of any program that sort of is going to meet their needs and help them make the transition into the world of work.
Yeah, great point, and a good one to finish off that last part of the session. I think there are absolute wades of international evidence out there that consumer co-design leads to better outcomes and significantly better impact for those vulnerable young people that need us most. Okay, so thanks so much, Keith. Really appreciate your presentation there. What we are going to do now, folks, is head to a break, our final break of the day. After this break, we will be welcoming back Keith along with Emma and Saul for the final panel discussion. There's still plenty of time to get your questions in. I've got a handful in front of me, so take the time throughout the next break, which is going to finish, and we're going to be back online here at 2:30, ready to go, and we'll all have you done on time as promised. Okay, thanks again, Keith, and we'll see you all back here at 2:30. Okay, folks, we're back for the final session of today's Youth Forum, focused on today's youth, tomorrow's future. I am joined by Emma, Saul, and Keith, who will be jumping in on this afternoon's panel discussion. There is still plenty of time to get your questions in through the chat box. I have a couple in front of me that will kick off this particular session, but also throughout the session, if you feel the desire to ask a question, feel free to take off your microphone and your camera and jump in and ask the panel any questions that you see fit. I found it incredibly interesting, the three presentations, very much presenting the challenges in the near and long-term future for young people and their recovery from COVID-19, but also plenty of opportunities. I think we always need to look at these things with hope and full of aspiration. So I can see that I've got Saul and Emma there with me. Thank you both. And I'm sure Keith will be rejoining us shortly. But in the interest of time, I'm going to jump into some questions. So my first question is for you, Saul. As I said, a self-proclaimed data nerd. I really did enjoy your presentation. You're a lot better at economics than I'll ever be. But one of the things I found most interesting was the correlation between countries' ability to keep COVID at bay and their economic performance. So my question to you is, will domestic spending in Australia be enough for our economy to continue in such a positive fashion?
Well, thanks, Ben, and thanks for your kind comments as well. The answer is no, because Australia's prosperity, particularly over the last 18 years or so, has relied enormously on the boost to our national income from our engagement with China. So unusually for a so-called advanced or industrialized economy, Australia is an importer of manufactured goods and an exporter of commodities and services. And that means that our relationship with China and the effects on us of the economic trajectory that China's been on, well, really since the late 1970s, but particularly in the late 20 years, has been very different from the experience of almost every other Western economy, with the partial exceptions of Canada and Norway. So what China has done over the last 40 years has been to emerge as the world's biggest exporter of manufactured goods, and in so doing has put downward pressure on the price of manufactured goods and put out of business a lot of producers of manufactured goods in other countries where manufacturing has always been much more important than it is here, whilst at the same time it's emerged as the world's biggest importer of commodities, and in so doing has put upward pressure on the price of commodities, which has been a bad thing for many other countries who are also importers of commodities, like Europe, North America, and even Japan to a significant extent. So almost uniquely among advanced economies, we've derived extraordinary benefits, not only from selling more stuff to China, but selling that stuff at higher prices than we could ever have imagined. And in so doing, we've also extracted higher prices for that stuff, iron ore, coal, whatever, from selling it to the people we've sold it to for a lot longer than we've been selling it to the Chinese, i.e. to the Japanese and the Koreans and the Taiwanese and anybody else who'll buy the stuff. And we are about, well, we've got company with Germany, I suppose, and Taiwan and Korea, but very few so-called advanced economies run trade surpluses with China. We're one of them. Ours is the second biggest of any country in the world. And that's one reason why China is now having a go at us. I mean, there are other reasons as well, which I won't go into or cast blame here, but China could not hurt the United States or the United Kingdom, who, after all, have said things that in their terms have offended the feelings of the Chinese people. They couldn't inflict the economic pain which they're seeking to inflict on us, because they don't buy much from the US and the UK. They run big deficits with them, big surpluses with them. They run a deficit with us. So, our prosperity, from the beginning of European settlement really, has depended on our capacity to export stuff, mainly commodities, but to export stuff to the rest of the world. Fortunately, in a sense, at least our goods exports, we can continue to export to the rest of the world. We haven't been able to export services to the rest of the world, that is in the form of tourists and international students, not because China won't let them come here, but because we won't let them in. And, I don't know how long we propose to keep this country as a prison in the way that I had thought we'd stopped being sometime in the 1850s. It was a bit later for Western Australia. They were still a prison until 1890. So maybe that's why self-imposed isolation has been so popular over there compared with the rest of the country. But I suppose the point I was making before was that keeping Australians at home, refusing to let them out, has forced Australians to spend at home money they would have preferred to and would have spent overseas if they had been allowed out. That has more than offset the loss of spending by keeping migrants as well as foreign students and tourists out. I suspect it's not sustainable indefinitely, but we could certainly get away with it for another year or so.
Yeah, really interesting. I think I'm drawing somewhat of a long bow here between your commentary around our decline in manufacturing our own goods, but also my experience in the northwest of Melbourne, and that is over many decades now where we have lost Australian manufactured goods. We've lost local jobs. Now, across the continent, we might have made up for that in other areas, but it goes to my question to you, Emma. And that is, you've noted a significant need around an increased level of entry-level jobs for young people. I've seen it, particularly across the northwest of Melbourne, where we don't have those particular jobs for young people to move into. What are some of your ideas in that space? You talked around the pillars of the guarantee. Yeah. What are your ideas that we can do to stimulate and create new entry-level jobs for young people?
So there's a couple of things that can be done in terms of what public policy can deliver here. And the first and most obvious one is for government to lead the way by providing those entry-level opportunities through a public service. And that's something that's worked quite well here in Victoria with its graduate recruitment program in the VPS. And there still do, of course, exist graduate opportunities across the Australian public service, but they're not as widespread as they once were, and they tend to be restricted to certain departments and certain sectors of certain departments. So we think there's an opportunity for both state and federal governments to look at increasing the number of graduate opportunities, not only within public service departments, but within public sector agencies as well, such as the ABC, NBNCO, and even to try to legislate around government business enterprises, government business enterprises, which NBNCO technically is, so is Australia Post. Beyond that, we do think one of the things that's really lacking today is that those graduate positions, entry-level positions in the private sector, aren't as widely available as they once were. So as I alluded to earlier, as university enrolments and graduations have risen over time, there's been a commensurate decline in the willingness of the private sector to provide on-the-job training, and particularly vocational skills training that used to be particularly in blue-collar jobs, entry-level jobs for men, especially for young men, could not necessarily have to complete a 3-year tertiary degree, but go into a trade or into a job and receive a combination of on-the-job training and training through a TAFE or other vocational provider. So there's been a real decline in that over the last 20 to 30 years as employers have expected everyone to land on their doorstep fully trained and ready to go. But business does need an incentive in order to invest in that. So whether that be a tax concession or a kind of levy, as we talk about, as Shirley talked about in the youth guarantee paper. One thing that worked quite well in the past was to say, well, if you're not going to provide training, then you'll pay an additional additional 1 or 1.5% in corporate tax or in business or in payroll tax, for example. You can offset that additional payroll tax by ensuring that that amount of money goes into training in your business. And in that way, the business is keeping that investment within their own company. One of the things we hear about all the time these days is that young people don't have enough loyalty to their boss, that they will move on from roles very quickly. But that's a two-sided equation, and the years where people spent a long time with a company was usually because they were given opportunities to advance or to enhance their skills. They had job security. They knew where they were going to be in that company in 2 years, in 5 years' time. So if we want that reciprocal relationship to be restored, and we want younger people to spend longer working for an employer so that they get the return on that investment, the investment has to come from the employer in the first place. So I think a combination of government leading the way through its own graduate opportunities, as I said, both state and federal governments, but also creating those appropriate incentives through the tax system and other structures to encourage private sector to do it as well.
Yeah, some really good points there. Keith, the next question comes probably at more of a local level around transition to work providers. So there's a little overview and a question at the end, so bear with me here. Keith, you spoke briefly about the transition to work and how the jury is still out in regards to outcomes. You then spoke heavily on the issues with Job Active and the key areas you've found. A number of the key areas you've spoken about in regards to personalised service, caseload sizes, and a compliance-based approach. These are targeted heavily by transition to work and have in fact department targets to meet in regards to all of these. Do you find this is something that transition to work aren't doing all that well? And that came from Daniel. You're on mute, mate.
Clearly through the evidence of the Commission was that qualitatively, the qualitative evidence that we received was both from young people and their experience of transition to work, as well as transition to work providers themselves. And
I think we've got an unstable connection there, Keith. We've lost you. I think we'll give the internet monkeys a second and let that recalibrate. I'll ask a wider question to the whole panel, and this is an ongoing theme in all of our conversations, but most of your presentations today around underutilisation or underemployment. I think it's a growing issue that we're facing that particularly is a challenge for young people, but also women. So a big, broad question, what else can we do to address underemployment or underutilisation?
My sense, Ben, is that for the most part, not completely, but for the most part, underemployment is a different manifestation of the more general problem of inadequate demand for labour. So partly because of the way in which the rules around the employment contract have changed, employers, if they want to reduce demand for labour, now have a choice between, putting it crudely, giving 5% of their workforce a 100% pay cut and giving 100% of their workforce a 5% pay cut if they want to reduce their total labour costs by 5%. And some of them are opting to avoid wholesale retrenchments, but instead to achieve the same cost reduction objectives by reducing hours for not necessarily all of their staff, but for a significant proportion of them, which makes it easier if there's subsequently an upturn in demand for their products, which requires more labour to be supplied, that rather than have to go out and hunt for new workers again, they can just ask those who they've put on reduced hours to work more time. That's one dimension of it. Another dimension of it is that, again, I think it's a byproduct of the way in which the rules around employment contracts have changed, that probably in days gone by, there would have been people employed in all sorts of employers who were being paid full-time wages for doing what was in effect part-time work. People were doing other things on the job than purely the tasks for which they're paid to do. They might be taking smokos or, just generally mucking around. And there wouldn't have been much that employers could have done other than dismissing people for egregious offences in that regard. Whereas now they can. The rules of the game allow employers to define hours of work much more narrowly than was the case before, and employers have taken advantage of that. So this is not a complete answer, and maybe Emma or Keith will have some different perspectives, which it would be equally valid. But my sense is that a big part of the answer to reducing underemployment is the same part of the answer as to reducing unemployment, that is to increase the demand for labour.
Yep, very good point.
I agree with that fundamentally at a macroeconomic level. I mean, the slack in the labour market, whether it manifests as unemployment or underemployment, is effectively the same phenomenon that's driving both those things. And the more demand there is for labour, then the less likely we will be to see underemployment. But I think it's important to look at how this has arisen and why we're in such a different situation now than we were in last time we had a recession in the early 1990s. And that's because the deregulation of the labour market has effectively encouraged underemployment and casualisation, because the mantra back 30 years ago was that wage demands were, crippling economic growth, and that was certainly true to some extent in the late 70s and early 80s. And so a lot of the reforms that were put in place around enterprise bargaining and so on in the early 1990s and the deregulation of the labour market were meant to drive productivity through flexibility. In my view, we've now gone far too far down that path. And so that labour is just looked at by labour, and by labour I mean working people, are just looked at by employers, and this is driven by economic theory, which is perfectly valid, as another unit cost of production. And in order to maximise profits and maximise growth, you keep the cost of production as low as possible. I think one thing that has happened as we've deregulated the labour market is that employers have ceased to regard their employees, not all employers, but the majority view and the kind of prevailing mentality around this is that employees are just another cost of production to an employer, and the cost of paying people, the cost of labour, should be reduced as far as possible, as any other business cost should be, in the pursuit of productivity. The problem is that productivity growth is going to profits rather than wages, and now for the first time since 1960, we have a higher share of productivity going to profit than going to wages. And effectively, underemployment, casualisation of employment, keeping people with fewer hours than they need, and what Saul referred to there, the benefit for employers in being able to say, well, I'll just pay you for the hours I need to pay you, and if my business, if there's a downturn, I'll roster you on for fewer hours a week, and then if there's an upsurge, I'll roster you on for more hours a week. You will be assigned work according to the demands of my business, not to the demands of or to the needs of you and your family. Yes, that's more efficient for employers. They're not paying for downtime, and they're only paying for the work that they need. But it's effectively shifting the risk of operating a profit-making enterprise, which is what a business is, away from the employer who benefits from the profits of that profit-making enterprise and onto the labour force. So that the risk of, well, I don't know if I'm going to need a 30-hour-a-week worker next week. I don't know how much business I'll have, but I take that risk because I am the owner of the business, is shifted onto the worker. And so your profits are stabilised, but the income of your workers are very unstable. And I think while there was a case to say that, there was a lot of fat in the system 40, 50 years ago, and we could do things more efficiently, we've now gone so far down that path that the incomes of working people are being sacrificed on the altars of profit. And I think we've got that badly out of whack, and people know we've got that badly out of whack. And what I referred to earlier, that reciprocal relationship between employers and employees has been massively undermined by that. So when people complain about young people only, not wanting to work all the hours or turning down shifts or moving on after 12 months and so on, it's a two-way street, and we're not seeing enough coming from the employers.
Yeah, the pendulum has certainly swung right the other way, which I think is incredibly challenging. And you spoke at a macro level. At a very micro level, one of the things that we find is that with a highly casual workforce, disengagement is real, but what happens is that we don't get to tap into the innovation and resilience of those that are underemployed or working casually, because they're not on the full-time payroll, they're not in the office or the factory engaging in innovating the business, which I think is another critical point. Keith, you're back. We're going to go back to you on the TTW question. We didn't get much at the start, so feel free to chomp away at that.
Yeah, look, I was just going to simply say that all the evidence that we gathered through the Commission in relation to transitional work, whilst it was qualitative in nature, was very positive about transitional work and very positive about transitional work reflecting what we felt were the key elements that were required to effectively engage young people. I suppose the point I was making in terms of the jury being out is that it's one thing for services to talk about their qualitative successes with young people, but it's another thing for sort of a hard measure of the outcomes achieved for those young people. And, we're still to see any real data from the department about what those hard outcomes look like.
Mm. It's interesting, even just in my own personal conversations with the department, there's been almost a reticence to lub transition to work into the same performance category as Job Active, because it's a different program. It does different things. There's an extended time frame. Young people are voluntary. But the one thing that is very clear is it gets young people back into study more than the mainstream employment services system, which I always think is a benefit. Young people learning and getting more qualifications is always a benefit. Okay, let's go on to my next question before I go over to the chat box. One thing that I was really interested about, and it came from Sol's presentation, open to everyone's thoughts, was the lack of significant data that correlates the rise in the gig economy and the jobs to job security or job stability. I haven't seen any specific data. Now we're saying there is no data, but yet whether it's perceived or real, people think the rise of the gig economy means the decline of job security and job stability. Does anyone want to talk to that point?
I'm happy to throw in a few ideas. People's instincts on these things are generally right, and I think it's certainly true that we don't have nearly enough data about the prevalence of gig economy jobs, where they're located, how they sit alongside other jobs. They're often second jobs. We're simply not collecting that data as we need to as yet, and that reflects, again, something that's not unusual, a lag time in regulatory processes to catch up with the realities of the labour market. I think the gig economy is not a new thing. What we're looking at, it's a new term to describe a very old phenomenon, which is effectively piecework, the work that's done according to you're paid for that piece of work rather than paid by the hour or paid according to a contract. That predates the Industrial Revolution, effectively. And a lot of what Australia's workplace laws and arbitration system in the early 20th century were put in place to do was to overcome a lot of that insecurity. It took a long time for that to happen. We had a high prevalence of piecework in Australia right through till after the Second World War. The reason it's called a gig economy, it's a new term. The difference really is that they're using internet platforms in order to drive these gigs and these services. It is a lack of regulation here that certainly even compared to the US and the UK, where, for example, rideshare drivers have recently been able to successfully appeal through the UK legal system to be classified as employees to a great extent. Our Fair Work system here does not allow that to happen. We had a similar case back in 2018 that failed under our current workplace regulations. So the gig economy has resurged for two reasons. One, yes, is the internet, and that's a platform that makes it very easy to connect people looking for piecework with people wanting to engage people to do piecework. But it's really just an exacerbation of the cash economy, or of the highly casualised nature of work that has been prevalent and has been growing really since the 1990s. It does contribute to wider levels of job insecurity and suppresses wage growth, because just like everything else in the labour market, it's about competition, it's about demand, and it's about availability. So if, for example, a lot of jobs that used to have to be, food delivery is a classic one. Restaurants used to employ a pizza delivery boy, usually a young guy on a bike or with his first car, and he would deliver a certain number of pizzas for that place. That's now not something that a business has to do. They can outsource that to Menulog or Deliveroo or whomever. And so it's effectively deregulating jobs at the lower end of the labour market in the first place. But it also means, it also puts some pressure on the labour market in another way, which is if I don't want to accept your casual 0 hours contract role, I'm as well off working for myself as a gig economy worker as I am accepting that kind of very low security, low paid job. We don't really know yet the extent to which the gig economy is affecting the broader labour market, because that data's not there. But since the mid-90s, early 2000s, there's been a real push in Australia to encourage people to become sole traders and contractors rather than employees. And that was pushed as a way of giving people a lot more control over their life and over their time. But of course, what it does at the same time is remove a lot of those protections that come with formal employment. Right. And the flexibility often is all one way. It suits a small number of people, particularly tradespeople, for example, to be sole traders. But there are now, we know, for example, a lot more women in midlife that have set up as sole traders or gig economy workers who would much prefer to have work that was more formal, but they are unable to find it to fit around caring responsibilities. So it's a complex issue. There are some people, particularly students and young people and people with second jobs, for whom gig economy work can be quite useful, but it does inevitably undermine some of the formal structures and arbitration processes that have built up to protect workers' rights for more than a century.
Yeah, really interesting take, Emma. And I think, I'm not sure whether this plays to your earlier point, Saul, around the focus on small business. I mean, this is constant government rhetoric as well, but small business aren't necessarily interested in growing or hiring more people. It's medium and larger enterprise. Yeah. Is that something that we can see as the future of Australian economy?
Well, I don't see any particular reason why it should change. And it's something, this is one of these things, it's a bit like the inanities of airport security, that I seem to be the only person I know who talks about them. But I have for a long time had this questioning notion about what I call small business fetishism. That is, the idea, as I put it in my presentation, that there is something inherently more noble about running a small business than there is about working for, let alone managing, a big one, or working for a government agency or a university or a not-for-profit. And that somehow, the whole economy depends on small business, and if only we appropriately genuflected at the small business altar, leaving them gifts in the form of lower taxes and, payroll tax breaks, not just lower rate of company tax, and subsidies that only they are eligible for, and so forth, then we could solve most of the problems that we have. And so you get, and this is not, it's characteristic of the coalition side of politics, but it's certainly not exclusive to them. Rudd and Albanese and Shorten and that sort of thing periodically genuflect at the small business altar as well, as do most Labor state premiers. And the reality is, it's just, I suppose, I don't want to offend anyone by saying this, but it's a bit like the virgin birth. People believe it in the face of, despite the fact that there's absolutely zero evidence for the fact that it's true. And it can be very hard to shake those beliefs by presenting people with evidence. But the evidence is that although, as proponents of small business like to say, over 40% of private sector jobs are in small business, that's a figure that, for whatever reason, excludes the big banks from the denominator. I don't know why. But, just over 40% of private sector jobs are in small business. What they don't tell you is that, 15 years ago, that figure was over 50. And while there are plenty of individual small businesses who have created jobs, of course there are, in aggregate, small business has not created a single job over the last 15 years. And yet we keep telling ourselves, or our politicians keep telling us, that if only we support small business, we'll get lots more jobs. The reality is that most small businesses have the number of staff they need. They're not particularly interested in growing, because if they grow too much, they cease to be a small business and actually have to start paying payroll tax, or might have to start paying company tax at a rate of 30% rather than 25%. Or the ATO might actually start looking seriously at all their spurious claims and, their avoidance of GST and other tax obligations, which small business does to a much greater extent than the multinationals and the rich folks, which we typically excoriate for failing to pay their share. My long-standing view has been that if we're serious about using policy instruments to favour particular types of business organisation in the belief that it will do positive things for job creation or innovation, then we should scrap all of the preferences we have, including at the state level, like payroll tax concessions for small business, and replace them with concessions or support for new businesses. And let me quickly spell out, I think it's 5 reasons why that's so. Number one is that new businesses, you should tell your son to send you an email, Keith, that new businesses are much more likely to be in sectors that have a sustainable future. Most small businesses are in the sectors they're in because that's the sector they were in when great-grandpa established the business, and they don't want to change. It's the only thing they know. The second thing is that new businesses are much more likely to be innovative than small businesses, because that's the main reason new businesses get set up, is to bring to market a new good or service, or a new way of producing or delivering an existing good or service. The third reason is that new businesses are much more likely to create employment because they're starting from a position where they don't have any employees, and they're likely, if their business plan succeeds, to at least need a couple more employees than they have when they start. The fourth reason is that while almost all new businesses are by definition small, most small businesses are not new, and therefore there are at any point in time a lot fewer new businesses than there are small ones, which means that the cost of giving them tax breaks or subsidies is a lot less than the cost of giving tax breaks and subsidies to small businesses. And you can therefore make the concessions or subsidies much more generous. You could actually say to a new business, you only pay company tax at a rate of 10%. Rather than 25 for the first 5 years of your existence. And the final reason, and it's an important one, is that there's nothing a new business can do to stop itself from becoming an older one, other than by going out of business altogether, in which case it doesn't get any subsidies. But therefore, you don't have the perverse incentives that we know exist with any concession to small business, that they stop growing at just below the point at which they cease to be a small business for the purpose of being eligible for these concessions. So if people were serious about saying, let's intervene, let's use policy instruments to favour some particular types of business, we get rid of all these completely wasteful and ineffective and ineffectual forms of support for small business just because they're small and for no other reason, and instead give more generous supports to new businesses, which are far more likely to do what you actually want them to do.
Well, there you go. You've heard it here first. Sol Eslake's 5-point plan to invest in youth-led new business creation. I like it. Okay, good to know. I'm gonna come across to you, Keith, now and just pretend that tomorrow is the not just budget day, but the federal government election, and you've put your hand up and you've won, and you've now been appointed the first ever youth-specific employment minister across the country. What would you do to the system?
Well, I mean, my point in my address was that it's not about a single system, it's about multiple systems. I think I'd probably start first with looking at education, because really we've got an education system that is way out of date and it's not fit for purpose. One of the interesting things we found in the commission was the exponential rise in alternative schools, and that really is in response to mainstream, both public and private schools, not being able to effectively engage all young people. But at the same time, the downside of that alternative school movement is that young people sort of see themselves ghettoised to a degree, and wondering why it is they can't get a similar service in a mainstream school. So I think I'd turn my eye pretty quickly to how we make the education system fit for purpose for young people. I'm really impressed by the work out at Templestowe Secondary College, where they have taken sort of a co-design model to education, taking the curriculum, the Victorian curriculum, but both students and teachers together looking at how it's actually delivered. And I think that's a very interesting model, pioneered by Peter Hutton, and there are expressions of that now popping over Australia. And I think, if I was the minister, I'd have a good look at that. I suppose the other area that I'd look at is the whole area around apprenticeships and traineeships, which, has just to a degree been bastardised and has nosedived in terms of attrition rates and take-ups of apprenticeships and traineeships. And no bloody wonder when, a young person's facing, the fact that they get paid more at McDonald's than they would as a first or second year apprentice, which choice they're going to make. So, there's a lot of work to be done around the apprenticeship traineeship model, I think. And then connected to that is also the investment in VET and VCAL in schools, the proper investment of VET and VCAL, so that we actually create real pathways for those young people that don't want to go on to tertiary study, do want to look at going into a trade, for example. But even then, I'd also be wanting to look at the apprenticeship and traineeship system extending beyond sort of blue-collar jobs to a much broader application. And then I suppose I'd also be looking at real job creation, and I think Emma made the point, government's got to lead the way on that, whether that's through the increase of their federal graduate program and the expansion of that, or whether it be even through their procurement processes and ensuring that there is a percentage of jobs within any procurement that is targeted towards young people, and and that those jobs are not about painting rocks white, but they're meaningful jobs and they're purposeful jobs for young people. So there's some of the things I'd start with, but that'd only be in my first 3 months, Ben.
Of course, would expect no less, Keith. I think the really key word there is purpose. I know working with young people in 2021 is something that is incredibly important to them, is purpose, and not only in their own job role, but the organisation they work for. They want to understand the impact that they're creating and that they're being a part of. So that's really interesting. Okay, my next question is going to come with, well, I suppose the deep antagonist inside of me is going to ask a question at the end of this statement. We have a significant discrepancy between the rise in HECS debt and wage expectations or wage capacity for new graduates. What we've done as a country is lower the threshold of repayments, and in some cases we've even doubled the cost of degrees. I mean, particularly in the social work field as an example, where we still face job shortages. So should young people just stop going to university?
That's very provocative, Ben. Can I jump in on this one, because it
Please
is something that we've written about in the Youth Guarantee paper, and that I've been looking at quite closely. So, no, young people shouldn't stop, and they won't stop going to university, as has been demonstrated by the fact that despite almost doubling the cost of humanities degrees, enrolments in humanities are up this year compared to previous years. So price signals when it comes to tertiary education really don't work the way that some people seem to think they do. The essential social contract of HECS, as I alluded to in my presentation, was originally quite simple and very valid, which was that if at the time HECS was introduced, something like only about, and Saul will probably correct me here, he'll have the historical data to mind, but really, well less than 1 in 5 young Australians were going to university. In fact, just before, at the beginning of the Hawke government, the high school completion rates weren't even in the majority. So by the end of the Hawke and Keating period, the majority of young Australians were graduating high school, and more of them were going to university. But it was still a fairly small proportion of people compared to where it is now. The view was, and the rationale for a Labor government introducing paid fees for tertiary education, which was vociferously opposed by a lot of the base. It was Whitlam, after all, who made tertiary education free in the first place. But the rationale was, those of you that are privileged enough to go to university, we're not talking about TAFE here, we're talking about university bachelor degrees, you will come out of that degree with a qualification that will give you an earning premium compared to people that don't have a degree. It will effectively mean that at the time the assessment was, you'd earn something like $1 million more over your lifetime. And so in recognition of that, you will be asked to make a small contribution to the cost of your degree. The basis being that until you started to earn a salary that reflected that wage premium, you wouldn't have to pay it back. So that if you trained in journalism or public relations and never got a job in that field and stayed on a fairly low wage job, you would never pay back the value of the cost of that degree because you hadn't benefited from it. Where we are now is very, very different. The rate of HECS is much, much higher. So I was one of the first university graduates to have encountered HECS right the way through my degree. I came out with a debt of around about $13,000 or $14,000, and it was paid off in my 20s. And only when I got a job related to my field of study did I start paying it off, and then it was paid off fairly quickly. What we have now is people graduating with massive HECS debts, tens or even over $100,000 for some degrees, and they're being required to pay them back at almost the minimum wage. So once they hit $45,000 a year, which is well below the average wage, they are now expected to repay the cost of that HECS debt. And a good chunk of people are doing so. They are paying back the cost of their HECS debt out of wages from the jobs that they had while they were studying. So they're still stuck in, not everyone's stuck in hospitality. Some people want to do that for the rest of their life, but a lot of people who are still waitressing when they intended to be, social worker or a psychologist are now paying for the degree without having seen the benefit of it. So that social contract there is fundamentally broken. I'm not in the school of people who say, we should immediately move to make all tertiary education free of charge again. As I said earlier, I think there's a much stronger case for free TAFE than there is for free university. But I do think that young people are being asked to take on far too much of that debt burden for their education, when the nexus between that education and our labour market outcomes is much weaker than it was, and they're carrying that debt burden at a much higher rate later into life, which is preventing their ability to start their life in other areas.
Yeah, it's a really critical area that I'm particularly interested in, because also if you think about young people who are vulnerable or who have not been able to complete, say, year 12, they're less likely to head off to university, but also they may not have had their aspirations fulfilled within them to think that they can get off to university. One of the things that we can do is improve the connection between TAFE and university by creating a free TAFE and making sure that young people get the opportunity to go off to free TAFE, and then creating better university partnerships within the TAFE environment. We see things like, for example, young, vulnerable people getting in and doing a diploma of enrolled nursing over 12 to 18 months, and then through a university partnership, getting their Div 1 registered nursing over the next 2 years, which, we hadn't thought was possible when I was back at school, which was not that long ago, 15, 20 years. So I think there's definitely some work there for us to do. Okay, one thing, sorry, go, Sol, jump in.
I was just going to say how much I agreed with what Emma said on HECS. I was showing my age here, but one of those lucky people who did my degree between 1975 and 1986 or whenever it was that HECS started. And so, I think I've paid for mine multiple times over through the tax system, and I don't complain about that, but I think the idea that there are both individual and social gains from higher education is absolutely right. And so people should contribute something to the cost of their tertiary education, but I don't think it should necessarily be more than 50% of it. And, the reality is, maybe Emma was too polite to say it, but I wouldn't be surprised if she didn't think it, that, this government just hates universities, and they hate them because they think, they turn kids from Liberal voting families into Labor voters. And, just in the same way as the government people say about the ABC that, quote, it's their people talking to our people, unquote, they think university lecturers and others are the same. And, this is one reason why universities, along with the big banks, which everyone liked to hate, whatever their political complexion, they were the two that were explicitly excluded from JobKeeper. Even though, as I mentioned, the big banks didn't really sack anyone during COVID, but the universities certainly found themselves having to sack quite a lot of people, and the government couldn't give a rat's because they hate universities. And in particular, they hate universities that turn out arts graduates and humanities graduates, because they're even more likely, to have come from Liberal voting families and end up being Labor voters, or even worse, Greens voters, when they come out of it. And, well, that's not going to change and it's ironic, because really, apart from Whitlam, the Prime Minister who did most to make tertiary education more accessible to a wider range of people, bearing in mind where he started, was Menzies. And for Menzies, again, I mentioned before about genuflecting at altars. No one who wants to be prominent in the Liberal Party can get by without ritually genuflecting at Sir Robert Menzies' altar on regular occasions. For Menzies wrote in his memoirs that one of his proudest achievements was making university education more accessible to what was a narrow range of people by our standards, but in his day and he introduced the Commonwealth scholarship system, and he set up alternatives to the Sandstone unit. So the reason that UNSW and Monash are where they are, and Flinders are where they are, and Griffith is where it is, that was all down to Menzies' time. But the Liberal Party's attitude to tertiary education has gone through a revolution in the last 25 years.
It's interesting, just sorry to be a bit cheeky, but Menzies was also very pro full employment and housing. And housing affordability, so if you look at the three big pillars that built Menzies' middle class, it was housing affordability, full employment, and tertiary education. And he's on entirely the other side to the current government on all of those issues now.
Full employment of men, though. Yeah,
of men.
Because
absolutely.
They couldn't married women still had to resign from the public service, and they couldn't change that until after Menzies had gone.
That's very true, Paul.
Wow, harking back. And I think sometimes we forget about the progress we've made. But my final question is, I suppose, targeted at something that you mentioned, Emma, but for our friends in regional places around Australia. We know that regional communities have felt the COVID-19 pandemic significantly worse, particularly those in areas of previously high tourism areas. But one thing that we talked about was regional employers find it more difficult to secure staff, more so than those in the metro areas. Now, the examples provided were in hospitality or maybe in health and social care. And the examples were that it takes 3 years to become a chef or 12 months to become an aged care worker. And there's that lag time that we need to deal with. What can we do to promote those workforces and those sectors to young people now? I know that we can't fix those lag times now, but what we can do is promote those as really good work opportunities increase for young people. What can we do about it?
We can increase their wages and conditions. I mean, the number one reason that young Australians aren't attracted to moving to the regions to pick fruit or work in hospitality or tourism is because those industries simply don't pay a market clearing rate of pay. Now, it is a complex argument, because if we were to pay for, and agriculture is a great example of this. So the agricultural sector really for the last 20 to 25 years entirely relies on a migrant workforce that is underpaid. It's endemic throughout that system. It's not, though, because farmers want to do that. It's because the price paid for their produce is too low. And then people will say, well, the only answer to that is for people to pay more for food. But actually, the big problem is that we have a supermarket duopoly that is price gouging on a lot of our produce. I mean, we produce way more food than we actually need. We're a net food exporter, but a lot of the problems in these regional areas, not only with agriculture, it's the clearest example, but with care jobs, the underpayment in early childhood education and care, aged care, disability care, whether residential or in home, hospitality, tourism jobs, is not only are the rates of pay very low, and that's usually because they are female dominated industries in reproductive sectors rather than productive sectors, but the work is insecure and they have been very deregulated. So when you say, for example, why are more young people not taking up the offer of $6,000 to relocate to regional Australia to work in one of these sectors, the answer is usually because they're not going to be promised more than 3 or 6 months of a contract, or they're not going to be promised guaranteed hours. So uprooting your entire life on that basis is not practical. So we really do need to look at the supply and demand issue here. And as Saul said earlier, I think one of the best things that the government could do would be to change those tax incentives towards newer businesses, more sustainable businesses, businesses that have the opportunity for growth, that are using renewables, that are looking at different business models in order to create jobs that have a future rather than propping up the jobs of the past. But also we need to recognise that the value of reproductive labour, particularly those jobs, foundational jobs, as I call them, in services, in care, community services, human services, are undervalued because of the nature of their work. And so we need to actually radically rethink how we value the value of that labour and how we remunerate it and invest in it accordingly. And that shift, that economic shift in thinking about the value of foundational work and the foundational economy is going ahead. It's starting certainly well advanced in Europe. You see Joe Biden now in America talking about his stimulus investment and him wanting to drive wages and jobs growth and having a specific focus on the care sector and on the undervaluing of that women's work of reproductive labour. It is a big economic shift, but it actually needs to happen. And it needs to happen not only because of the demand for those workers. We're going to need more than 30,000 new early childhood and education and care workers in the next 3 years, and more than 200,000 aged care workers in the next 5 years. And we need those to be sustainable jobs because they're not easily automated, and the demand for them is increasing.
Wow, what a complex answer to a complex.
Sorry.
Well done. No, please don't apologise. It was very, very well articulated in a short amount of time. However, we have come to an end for this session. I would like to thank Saul, Emma, Keith, for your wonderful contributions. At the end of this 3-part series, we will be, or Jobs Australia will be preparing a submission to the Commonwealth Government to consider on the future of work for young people. So all of these thoughts and ideas and suggestions and strategies will definitely be counted for. And to everybody else, all of the attendees, I want to say thank you for sticking with us today. Please join us next week as we hear more from the sector, but also, and probably most importantly, we hear from young people themselves and those that employ young people. So thank you all again for a wonderful day. I've learned something. Stay safe. See you next week.
Thanks, Ben. Bye.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Bye.